A faint light shimmered ahead, barely visible in the dark void. The man who once wore a crown had never believed in the stories about light at the end of the tunnel. He had heard them from people who claimed to have brushed against death, waking with tales of glowing paths. Now, surrounded by darkness, he noticed that the point of light was real and gradually drawing closer. Despite everything, he found himself wondering how it had come to this. His last memory was of solitude in his lavish bedroom. The bed was grand, the windows tall. He stood in silence, staring at the city lights below. When he finally lay under the soft sheets, a crushing heaviness overtook him. Suspicion surfaced. Perhaps he had been poisoned. Many had reason to wish for his death. Near the bedside, a knife and sheath rested quietly. Across the room, a display case held a ceremonial sword and a crown, both symbols of a life lived under constant threat. As much as he tried to understand what led to his end, the answers never came. Acceptance crept in. All he could do was surrender to whatever came next, though he silently hoped he would not be greeted by a chorus of winged infants. The light brightened. Sounds began to form around him, soft voices offering congratulations to a couple. They welcomed a healthy baby boy. Blurred shapes of a man and woman entered his vision. The former king realized, slowly and with disbelief, that he had been reborn. The woman asked her husband to hold the child so she could see him better. Her voice held warmth. The child understood every word. Somehow, their language was familiar. It reassured him. Her face glowed with gentle affection, and in her eyes he saw a quiet strength. She called the baby beautiful, noting how he had her hair. The father, rugged and broad-shouldered, spoke next. He smiled as he claimed the child had his eyes. The baby looked at the man, expecting someone with such sharp features to be stern. Instead, he waved with an open grin and called himself the boy's father. A brief moment of disbelief flickered before settling into quiet acceptance. The room seemed modest. Pieces of armor hung on the walls. A candle in the corner cast a soft glow. Everything appeared calm, far from the stone halls of his former palace. He studied the room silently from within his new body. Alice, the woman who held him, was his mother now. Outside, a small house with a thatched roof sat in the middle of a clearing. Its white walls gleamed in the sun. Time passed slowly. Reynolds, his new father, embraced Alice as she cradled their son. Though gentle in nature, Alice commanded the household with steady resolve. Reynolds, on the other hand, was dependable, if sometimes clumsy in his enthusiasm. Though grateful for the love surrounding him, the child carried the weight of memories no infant should bear. He tested his limits by stretching his limbs, only to realize he had little control over them. A faint green mist rose from his diaper, reminding him that his body obeyed its own rules. Alice changed him without hesitation, while he flushed with silent embarrassment. Perhaps it was the discipline forged during his years as a ruler that allowed him to endure. The faint hope that this was a dream also lingered. One day, Alice carried him through a crowded market. The world around them felt ancient, as though time had been reversed. Men walked past carrying enormous swords, their blades worn but well kept. The sight puzzled him. A vendor shouted about stamina elixirs, offering them for only 2 coppers. The baby thought the colorful bottles looked far from medicinal, yet they were being sold freely. Alice glanced at him, commenting on how tired he looked. He scowled silently, only for a nearby shopper to declare she would take 3 of the elixirs. Later, he lay on a pillow, staring at the ceiling in thought. Knowledge was still power. For weeks he had watched, listened, and studied. Reynolds returned home with a cheerful call, lifting his son high into the air. The child's stomach twisted. Alice panicked, yelling at her husband for tossing the baby so recklessly. The infant grew pale. Even this simple act overwhelmed his frail body. Reynolds laughed, convinced the baby enjoyed it. He continued, spinning him once more. A scream erupted as nausea returned. A sharp bump against the wall followed. Fear spread across Reynolds's face when Alice approached, her voice calm but threatening. Reynolds retreated to a corner, rubbing the growing lump on his head. Alice turned to her son, gently whispering to him. She brought her hand to his bruised knee. A soft light emerged. The baby watched closely as the scrape healed under her touch. She held him once more, assuring him that it was better now. In her arms, he looked up at her with new understanding. Perhaps, he had judged this world too quickly. In his previous life, Arthur had been a king. From atop towering walls, he had looked down on fields where armies clashed beneath his command. Seated on a mechanical steed, he had led battalions into battle, raising a blade beside machines and defeating envoys from nations across the globe. On one such field, a soldier had fallen before him. Victory had been routine, yet none of those triumphs filled him with as much pride as what he felt now. Arthur smiled faintly. He stared ahead with quiet determination. Crawling across the wooden floor, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Nearby, Alice warned Reynolds to keep him away from sharp corners. Reynolds, still watching, added that the shelf posed a bigger threat. Despite their caution, Arthur bumped his head on a mirror. He sat down, dazed, gazing at his reflection. The parents chuckled. Arthur was fixated on the mirror. Months had passed, yet he still had not grown used to his new name. Arthur, he thought, was too soft for someone who once ruled a nation. Nevertheless, as he pressed his palms against the mirror, he had to admit the baby staring back was undeniably cute. A grin tugged at his lips. He looked at his reflection with firm resolve, already imagining how many hearts he would break in the future. That evening, Alice kissed him on the cheek as he lay tucked in bed. She whispered a soft goodnight before leaving the room. The moment the door closed, Arthur opened his eyes. With focused intent, he raised his arms. The operation had begun. He pushed the blanket aside, tossed it to the floor, and climbed out of bed. Swinging one leg over the crib's railing, he dropped down and landed on the folded blanket with practiced precision. Now that Alice believed he was asleep, he estimated he had an hour before she returned to check. He crawled forward quietly, then paused to glance at her. She stood by the sink, humming as she washed the dishes. He resumed his journey with purpose. His target was close. He passed through the open door and entered the study. Inside, books lined every wall. He clenched a tiny fist. Mission successful. He sat for a moment, taking in the quiet room. This study had become his sanctuary. Ever since discovering it, he had visited night after night to better understand this unfamiliar world. Arthur opened a book displaying a hand-drawn map. The continent was called Decathan, home to 3 major kingdoms. Eleanor, the elven realm, lay hidden within vast forests. Darv, the dwarven kingdom, spread deep underground. Sapin, the human domain, was the largest and most densely populated. He found the structure familiar. Like his old world, this one operated under a monarchy. However, power here passed through bloodlines, not merit. Pulling a book closer, Arthur toppled backward. Lying on the floor, he raised the volume and began to read. Compared to the advanced society he once ruled, this world was underdeveloped. A flickering candle nearby confirmed it. The book before him was titled, A Guide for Beginner Privileged Magicians. Magic, he thought, now that was worth studying. He flipped through the pages slowly. Symbols and diagrams filled the chapters. In his old world, warriors cultivated ki, an internal energy harnessed through discipline. It enhanced strength and sharpened weapons. Here, the force was called mana. Unlike ki, which existed only within the body, mana flowed throughout the world. He read further. Magic users in this world were categorized by 2 main methods, augmenting and conjuring. Augmenters used mana to fortify their physical abilities. They gained unmatched power, agility, and resilience, though their attacks lacked range. Conjurers released mana into the environment, bending the world to their will. However, they needed to absorb external mana to fill their cores before casting spells. Arthur recalled Alice healing his bruised knee. She must be an emitter, a rare type of mage capable of using restorative mana. The text described them as deviants, able to manipulate mana in unique ways. Most mages experienced their first awakening during adolescence. The process involved the formation of a mana core, which sounded remarkably similar to the ki center of his past life. Back then, young warriors trained to sense fragments of ki scattered inside their bodies, gathering them to form a center. Curious, Arthur sat upright and closed his eyes. He folded his legs and focused inward. Light appeared in his vision. It felt like progress. His lips curled into a pleased smile. Before he could explore further, strong arms lifted him. Alice cradled him gently, relieved to find him safe. Her expression shifted as she sniffed the air. She asked if he had been trying to go to the toilet. Arthur grimaced. Moments ago, he had been preparing to begin his path as the greatest mage in the world. Now he was just a baby with a soiled diaper. Green mist puffed out from beneath him. Alice chuckled and said he clearly had no trouble in that department. It was time for a change. Arthur's cheeks flushed with shame. He had hoped to conquer mana and reach enlightenment, yet here he was, reduced to nothing more than a baby needing a fresh diaper. Books lined the shelf while Alice sat quietly at the table. She opened her diary, dipped a quill in ink, and brought it to the page. Her hand moved steadily as she recorded her thoughts. Over 2 years had passed since Arthur's birth, yet each day brought something new. With every step and gesture, her son continued to surprise her. Arthur's parents stood nearby, supporting him as he took uncertain steps forward. A small smile lit up his face. Alice watched him and felt a mix of pride and caution. He truly might be the most adorable child in the world. She held him close, brushing a hand over his chestnut hair. His deep azure eyes met hers with an awareness that felt far too sharp for a child his age. She had already decided that she would have to become a firm, dependable mother. It was the only way to keep him from future trouble. Relying on Reynolds for discipline had proven ineffective. Arthur's small hands wrapped tightly around a wooden stick. Alice turned to see Reynolds standing behind him, clearly guiding their son in the proper grip. She narrowed her eyes. He was already trying to teach the boy to wield it like a sword. She returned to her writing, noting how she had stopped Reynolds from introducing combat training far too early. Arthur had only just learned to crawl when that idea first came up. Her husband's enthusiasm remained relentless. Later that week, Alice walked down a cobbled street in central Ashbur, holding her son's hand. A merchant's sign ahead displayed polished knives, and Arthur reached out curiously. One detail that had become obvious was his fascination with shops. He loved browsing stalls and peeking into displays. For that reason, Alice no longer did groceries once or twice a week. Their visits had become a near-daily affair. Arthur paused before a stand lined with smooth, colorful stones. His attention shifted toward a magician showcasing enchanted rings. Flames danced from one of them as the man conjured fire mid-air. Alice wrote that she had no intention of spoiling her son, yet these frequent outings did serve a purpose. Fresh ingredients were important, and the constant exposure to city life had its educational merits. Watching him grow so quickly, she began to wonder about his future. Her pen scratched steadily across the page. Arthur reminded her so much of Reynolds, and she had no doubt that adventuring would one day catch his interest. The thought left her uneasy. Too many naive youths chose that path, drawn by stories rather than reason. She could only hope that Arthur would be better prepared. Her eyes drifted toward the corner where Arthur had quietly crawled away again. His love for sneaking into the study had yet to fade. She crossed the room, lifted him gently from the floor, and considered relocating his bed into the study just to make things easier. With Arthur in her arms, she stepped out and closed the diary. The quill returned to its place in the ink, and the study was left behind. Later that afternoon, Arthur stood by the window, staring outside with wide eyes. Below, Reynolds was in the yard, removing his gloves and tossing them aside. 2 years had passed since Arthur first began his long journey of learning. Much has changed since then. Every day still felt like an adventure. Reynolds stood tall with both hands outstretched. Arthur pressed closer to the glass, watching in fascination. His father muttered something under his breath, lips moving in focused rhythm. A stone near his feet trembled and began to rise slowly into the air. The movement continued. The stone floated higher, steady in Reynolds' grasp. Power swirled faintly around him. Arthur stared, amazed by what he saw. As Reynolds lifted his arms, more stones followed, spinning gently in the air around him. Arthur's gaze locked onto the display. Wonder filled his chest. The magic was real, and it was just the beginning. Reynolds stood firm as stones floated into the air before him. With his legs spread and gaze focused, he raised one arm and hurled the stones forward. Arthur observed the scene from the window. His father closed his eyes in satisfaction, then turned and noticed his son watching. Reynolds struck a confident pose, proud of his display. Arthur remained unimpressed. He wondered if that was truly all. 3 minutes of deep concentration to throw something that could have been tossed by hand with half the effort. A gentle hand landed on his head. Alice smiled and asked if he had been watching. She turned to the yard and sighed as she noticed the scattered debris. Reynolds had ruined the front lawn again. Reynolds slipped his gloves back on, brushing off the dust. Alice continued to watch him with quiet amusement. Arthur, meanwhile, reflected on a recent discovery. His father was an augmenter, someone who used mana to enhance their physical abilities. He began to wonder what sort of power he would develop when his own mana core awakened. Outside, Reynolds resumed his stance. His fists clenched, and his focus shifted to a single falling leaf. The moment it hit the ground, he moved. A punch flew forward, followed by a kick, then a swift elbow. Each movement left a faint shimmer in the air. He exhaled slowly, rotating his hand in a circular motion as energy settled. Arthur smiled slightly, then turned from the window. A sudden realization hit him. He was standing on a bench. Looking down, he froze. The floor felt far away. A knot of fear formed in his chest. His knees bent and he tried to climb down, but one trembling leg hung in the air. His expression darkened. Alice looked over and quickly crossed the room. She picked him up gently and placed a kiss on his forehead. It was time for a nap. Arthur turned his gaze to the study and extended his hand toward the shelves. He tried to explain that he wanted the books. Alice responded with a smile and told him it could wait. Sleep came first. Disappointment flickered in his eyes. He pushed his palms together and looked up at her with pleading eyes. A soft glow seemed to surround him as he stared longingly at the study door. Alice squinted and groaned in defeat. Eventually, she agreed to let him spend a little time there. As she carried him, Alice felt a pang of guilt. Other boys his age played outside or napped in a nursery. Perhaps it was time to set one up. Arthur stepped into the study and reminded himself there was no shame in using every advantage available. Even a great warrior had to rely on strategy. He settled onto the floor with a book in front of him. Alice smiled as she watched from the doorway. A sudden noise in the distance interrupted her thoughts. She left the study, muttering about Reynolds and his habit of destroying trees. She will return soon. Arthur turned his head as the door closed. This room held his greatest accomplishment aside from the knowledge he had collected, the formation of his mana core. He sat cross-legged in front of an open book. For 2 years, he had guided tens of thousands of fragments of mana, pulling them together near his solar plexus. A gentle light now glowed inside his chest. His eyes remained shut. He finally understood why natural core formation often lasted until adolescence. The fragments were slow, difficult to move, and hard to control. His lips tightened. Each fragment resisted. His body and mind strained with effort. Still seated in meditation, Arthur poked his tongue out slightly in concentration. The 2 years of work were not wasted. The light inside him glowed brighter. He felt close. Only one last fragment remained. Outside, Reynolds held the broken trunk of another fallen tree. Alice approached and handed him a glass of water with a faint smile. Birds flew calmly overhead. A loud explosion suddenly shattered the peace. Reynolds grabbed Alice and shielded her from the blast. Flames erupted behind them. He pulled her close, shielding her with his back as the shockwave tore through the yard. His eyes shut against the heat. The stream of fire intensified. Alice clung to Reynolds as the fire surged around them. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, shielding her from the heat. Her breathing was uneven, panic growing in her chest. As they turned back toward the house, Alice's gaze fixed on the flames consuming their home. Her voice broke through the chaos as she cried out for Arthur. Reynolds froze, then clenched his jaw. Without hesitation, he dashed into the wreckage, brushing past debris and forcing his way inside. He pushed deeper through the smoke, eyes scanning the destruction. The moment his gaze fell on the sight ahead, his steps halted. His knees buckled, and he collapsed, eyes wide in disbelief. His breath caught, lips trembling. Tears streamed down his face. Behind him, Alice arrived, panting, and dropped beside him. Her question hung unanswered as she followed his gaze. Suspended in the air was Arthur, floating effortlessly, surrounded by glowing traces of mana. They watched in silence as the boy slowly descended. Arthur touched the ground, placed his hands behind his back, and smiled. A warmth filled him. He marveled at the sensation of forming his mana core, feeling as if even the trees around him had grown more vibrant. However, as he looked around, the devastation began to register. Standing amid the rubble, he asked if the house had been attacked and wondered who had dared to damage the king's home. Months passed. Their home was rebuilt, and life gradually returned to a steady rhythm. On a quiet afternoon, Arthur lay in bed with Alice, reading from a book. Over the years, he had made significant progress. He had learned to read and write, and Alice introduced him to different texts. With growing curiosity, he studied mana manipulation and methods to increase its flow. Reynolds joined his training by showing diagrams and sparring techniques, although Arthur's small body limited physical practice. Despite the challenges, he was determined. His father introduced him to basic strength training, guiding him through sit-ups and push-ups. Recently, Arthur received a wooden sword for his 3rd birthday, a sign of his commitment to serious training. That day, while he was immersed in reading, Reynolds burst into the room, booming with energy. He declared it was time to train, holding out Arthur's sword. Papers flew aside as they stepped outside. Father and son stood across from each other. Reynolds raised the stick high and reminded Arthur of his lessons, how to combine mana flow with breath, to treat the core like an organ, just as natural as the lungs or heart. Arthur stared blankly. The instructions felt far too abstract for someone his age. Still, he focused. He positioned himself to strike and launched forward. Each blow he delivered was met with a smooth block. Reynolds parried easily, laughing and cheering him on. Arthur's frustration grew. His father's refusal to ease up pushed him further. He knew dinner would soon be served, and he wanted to finish. He gathered his strength, eyes narrowing as he focused. With renewed determination, he struck once more. The stick snapped. It flew through the air before hitting the ground. Reynolds stood stunned. He hadn't expected his son to break through. Arthur squatted down, asking if he could finally head to the study. Reynolds nodded in approval. Inside, Arthur sat cross-legged on the bed. His mind visualized the formation of the monocore. In this world, strength was measured by its color, beginning with black, a mixture of blood and impurities. With time and purification, it transformed. He imagined the stages clearly: black, red, orange, yellow, silver, and finally white. A white bucket symbolized the highest stage. Each color had 3 shades: dark, solid, and light, each one representing the purity and density of the core. The lighter it became, the more energy it held. Arthur envisioned the energy collecting near his heart, slowly filtering itself. In his mind, a man with a white core stood calmly, arms outstretched, embodying serenity and strength. This was his goal. However, a loud voice shattered his concentration. He frowned. Dinner was ready. At the table, plates of food and glasses of water awaited. Alice ate with quiet satisfaction, while Reynolds did the same. Arthur stabbed at his food, visibly irritated. He longed for solitude. His thoughts raced with questions and theories, yet there was always noise. Always someone near. He leaned his head into his hand, tapping his utensils with exaggerated frustration. Reynolds watched him thoughtfully, then offered a solution. Perhaps it was time to find Arthur a real mentor. Alice stood with her staff raised, frustration etched across her face as she directed her anger at Reynolds. Her voice rang through the air, declaring that Arthur was only 4 years old. In front of her stood a whimsical army of animated carrots, each one notched with arrows aimed at Reynolds. He remained calm, clad in armor and surrounded by his own group of enchanted vegetables, stating that he could guide Arthur. Both parents stood firm in their positions, debating over their son's training. Although playful in appearance, the argument was serious. Reynolds believed Arthur's early display of mana manipulation meant he was only holding the boy back. His stance was unwavering. Alice, overwhelmed, unleashed a surge of energy. The carrots lunged forward in a flurry of magical attack. Their disagreement escalated at the dinner table. Alice insisted that their son was too young to be sent to a distant city. Reynolds replied that Xyrus was not just any city, and he had arranged for a friend to take care of Arthur there. Arthur, silent, continued eating while the table shook with tension. Eventually, one of the parents slammed a hand on the table. They both turned to him, asking for his decision. The child paused, crumbs still on his lips, confused by the weight of such a choice. He set down his utensils and suggested that the family visit the teacher together before making a final decision. Reynolds looked at Alice with approval. She raised a brow in surprise. Arthur wondered if he had said something wrong. Yet, his parents laughed, admitting they had not considered the idea. Alice agreed, saying she would feel more at ease seeing the situation herself. Reynolds struck the table again, his excitement sending a plate into the air. He announced they would all head to Xyrus together. Arthur sat wide-eyed as plans for the 3-week journey took shape around him. Later that night, Arthur pored over a book. Something in it seemed familiar. He studied each page carefully until Alice entered the room. She took the book gently, reminding him it was time to sleep. They were leaving at dawn. As he climbed into bed, she tucked him in, admitting she disliked rushing too. Before leaving the room, she mentioned that old friends would accompany them to the city. These companions had helped rebuild their house and remained close allies of Reynolds. She kissed Arthur's forehead and added that if she did not catch him reading again, he could bring a few books on the road. As darkness filled the room, Arthur nodded in agreement and whispered good night. The familiar voice responded. Lying quietly, he recalled what he had heard. Their escort included 2 conjurers and 3 augmenters, each capable of handling any danger along the way. Arthur realized he was finally about to step beyond his quiet town. The world outside waited. Morning came swiftly. The family made their way through the forest trail. Ahead, the long path stretched forward, and someone waved from the distance. A red-haired man approached and embraced Reynolds warmly. After the greeting, Reynolds gestured toward Arthur, introducing him to the group. Arthur bowed slightly and stated his name. The red-haired man, Adam Crench, ruffled his hair and praised his manners. He was an augmenter, known for his expertise with spears. Before Arthur could react, a tall blonde woman swept him into a tight embrace. She called him precious and teased that he clearly took after his mother. Her name was Angela Rose, a conjurer skilled in wind magic. Pressed against her chest, Arthur found it hard to breathe. Fortunately, a large hand lifted him away by the collar. A deep voice chided Angela for squeezing too hard. Arthur looked up at the towering man now holding him. Despite his size, the stranger's face was gentle. This was Durden Walker, an earth magic augmenter. He placed Arthur carefully on the ground and gave him a friendly pat. To Arthur, Durden seemed like a friendly giant, like a loyal dog eager to help. The man smiled warmly, raising a finger in encouragement. Arthur glanced away quickly, unsure how to respond. Nearby, a quiet girl sat by the wagon. She had dark hair and sad eyes. Her name was Jasmine Flamesworth, an augmenter known for her skill with dual daggers. She kept her head low and moved toward the cart without speaking. As Arthur observed her, another girl approached and explained that Jasmine simply needed time to adjust. She extended her hand in greeting, introducing herself as Helen Shard, an augmenter who specialized in magical archery. Reynolds called the group to attention. It was time to begin their journey. Supplies were loaded into the carts, and despite the difficulty, preparations were completed swiftly. Once everyone was aboard, Reynolds asked if they were ready. Inside one of the wagons, Alice sat with Arthur, both confirming they were fine. The convoy set off, the wagons drawn by large lizards bred for speed and endurance. As they moved forward, Arthur looked out across the vast landscape. Lush valleys and vibrant forests passed by in the distance. His journey had begun, and for the first time, the world opened before him with all its promise and challenge. Night had fallen, and the group remained deep in the forest. While the others battled monsters nearby, Alice sat near the fire, stirring a pot of stew. Reynolds and Jasmine approached her, dragging two massive wolf corpses across the clearing. The rest of the party gathered around the flames. Arthur, resting his head on his hand, sat quietly near the edge. Helen approached the boy and asked how he was feeling. He raised his hands and gestured that he felt tired. She offered comfort, reminding him it was only his first real journey in this life. Sitting beside him, she mentioned that his father had spent most of the trip bragging about his son being a genius magician. She then asked if it was true that he had awakened his mana a year ago. Nearby, Adam observed the conversation. He stood, stretched his limbs, and announced that he needed to loosen up before bed. Recalling that Reynolds had no objections to training with Arthur, he asked if he could spar with the boy now. Arthur frowned, assuming the man only intended to stretch alone. Reynolds glanced at his son, gave a small nod, and reminded Adam to go easy since the boy had only begun light mana training. Without warning, Adam lifted Arthur by the scruff of his tunic. The boy's parents watched with concern, though neither protested. At his age, most children barely managed to climb stairs. Yet here, no one questioned sparring against a 4-year-old. The two faced each other, ready. Adam grinned, teeth clenched, asking if the boy was prepared. He waved his sword while Arthur watched silently. Adam dropped into a stance and asked if the boy could enhance his weapon. In that instant, a spectral tiger formed behind Adam. Fear crept into Arthur's eyes. From the side, the others watched in silence. Arthur turned to Reynolds, reaching out telepathically to warn that Adam was overflowing with bloodlust. He wanted to be pulled from the fight. Instead, his father grinned and encouraged him to give his best. Arthur lowered his head, disappointed. His father, he thought, was being no help. Closing his eyes, he summoned the presence within him. The shadow of a great king loomed behind him. He tightened his grip on his sword, channeling mana into his limbs. His small body burst forward, aiming directly at Adam. The red-haired man smiled and prepared to counter. As Arthur approached, Adam's blade moved with precision. The boy was knocked to the side, unsure of what had just happened. Regaining his footing, he lunged again. He cursed under his breath, blaming his small frame. Adam turned in surprise as the child came flying again. This time, Arthur's sword glowed as he launched another strike. Adam swung back, but Arthur jumped into him, using the weight of his body to slam the man off balance. Midair, Arthur readjusted, swinging again with force. Adam tried to kick him, though the boy dodged. He landed, eyes wide with fear, as Adam came charging once more. The man raised his weapon and brought it down in a sharp motion. At that moment, Newton's third law came to Arthur's mind. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Adam's strike sent Arthur flying. His sword slipped from his hands, and his body slammed into the ground. Alice screamed. Arthur lay still, bruised and shaken. Durden walked over to Adam and struck the back of his head firmly, scolding him for hitting the child too hard. Adam rubbed his head and demanded to know who had trained such a young boy into a miniature monster. Reynolds shrugged, smirking, and insisted he hadn't trained the child in that way. Alice knelt by her son, applying healing salve to his elbows. She asked if it was true that Reynolds had taught him. Arthur raised his hands and explained that he learned by watching his father and reading books. The adults looked at each other in disbelief. Books alone had taught him techniques none of them had seen before. Curiosity filled the air as they asked Arthur to show them those movements. The boy smiled and began demonstrating. He explained that one must cross the back leg over the lead leg, push off with mana, and allow the body to fall naturally. Then, a sudden thrust of force sends the momentum forward. While he spoke, Helen attempted the move and stumbled. At the same moment, Adam tried to replicate it, only to lose balance. His body was launched through the air, crashing into a tree with a loud thud. Arthur walked over calmly and found Adam with his head buried inside the tree trunk. Adam raised his thumb, signaling he was all right. Several days had passed since the group began their journey toward the city of Xyrus. Near a quiet waterfall, Alice washed Arthur while the others leapt from the cliff into the water. During this time, Arthur's birthday had come and gone without much celebration. As he stared off into the distance, Jasmine held out a dagger, calling it a birthday gift wrapped as a lesson. Adam appeared from beneath the surface, flicking water from his hair while the others smiled at the sight. Training had continued steadily with modest progress. Adam watched the group, then without warning, Durden was hurled off the cliff, crashing into the water below. Arthur observed from a distance, noting how quickly Jasmine had begun to pick up techniques, especially ones as intricate as the feint step. Along the shoreline, the younger men laughed and wrestled, pushing each other around like children. Despite the playful air, Arthur remained confused by Jasmine's ability to grasp instructions so quickly. The sun remained high as they all moved with purpose. Angela worked on healing Jasmine's minor injuries while Alice turned to her son and urged him to pack up quickly. Arthur placed a book into his bag and smiled, announcing he was ready to go. The group soon resumed their travel, passing through a strange gorge with towering cliffs and deep shadows. The ground trembled briefly as the footprint of something massive pressed into the earth nearby. Under the open sky, the group chatted lightly. Adam recalled how Reynolds had a habit of leading them into unnecessary trouble. The redhead approached and smiled down at Arthur, drawing laughter from the group. Helen added that Reynolds likely wasn't the only troublemaker, hinting at a time they all stumbled into a strange situation. Before she could finish, Reynolds cut her off and insisted it had just been a small rodent. She frowned slightly, disappointed by the interruption. Arthur noticed the change in his mother's mood as he sat next to her. He asked if she was all right. She offered a tired smile and said she was fine, just a little weary. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. A book remained in his other hand as he continued reading quietly. Though focused, something gnawed at him, making his shoulders tense. He lowered his gaze and turned sharply toward a noise, which shifted to a quiet fear. It was Jasmine. She glanced through a window in the cart and whispered a request to teach her more. Arthur didn't respond. His eyes dropped back to the book. Suddenly, the ground shuddered. Arthur flinched in panic. Alice turned and asked what was going on. A shout rang out from the front. Helen declared they were under attack and that bandits were approaching. Angela stepped forward, extended her dagger, and commanded the wind to shield them. A powerful gust formed a barrier as Alice rushed to shield her son. Arrows tore through the air, striking against the wind wall with sharp force. They rattled across the sides of the cart and splintered against nearby trees. Arthur looked up and caught sight of Jasmine, now in a firm stance. Reynolds stepped forward. Durden gripped his staff tightly. Adam readied himself and moved to intercept. Though an arrow struck her leg, Helen pulled it out quickly, unfazed. She flipped back and landed on one knee, aiming her arrows forward. Inside the cart, Alice and Arthur remained frozen, surrounded by unfamiliar figures. Arthur scanned the area, spotting hostile shapes emerging from the grass. Their weapons were ready, faces partially hidden. One figure stood taller than the rest. An axe was buried at his side, and his scarred chest suggested years of brutality. His twisted smile stretched across his face as he declared they had caught something valuable. He approached with slow confidence. His features were unpleasant, thick lips and a leering stare. He instructed his men to spare only the women and child, warning them not to leave scars. Damaged goods, he said, would sell for less. Arthur remained still, lost in thought. He had been inside the protective bubble too long. The tension in the air deepened as the cruel man stood with his subordinates, watching them with mocking eyes. Arthur clenched his jaw. He had nearly forgotten that every world, no matter how peaceful it appeared, always had monsters in human skin. His gaze shifted upward. The term damaged goods echoed in his mind, weighing heavily on his heart. He gripped the hilt of his small sword with determination. His expression was serious, almost cold. Alice, sensing the danger, pulled him close and shielded him beneath her arms. Her eyes trembled with fear, though her voice remained soft, reassuring him that he wasn't alone. At first, Arthur felt surprised by her words, then the calm in her tone soothed him, and he began to breathe easier. Without warning, arrows tore through the air. The first struck the side of the cart. Chaos followed immediately. The warriors around them rushed into position, shouting orders to defend the group. Durden raised an earth wall to intercept the barrage. Still, the arrows kept flying. Their path curved violently toward where Alice and Arthur huddled together. For a moment, Angela held them off with gusts of wind. Her expression stayed fierce as she repelled each shot. The bandits grew impatient. They began targeting her directly. The brunette leapt from behind the wall and launched arrows of her own. The enemy responded swiftly, deflecting her shots with well-timed movements. Reynolds appeared high above, leaping from the cliff without hesitation. His descent was silent until the moment his feet struck the ground, sending rocks in all directions. Without pause, he attacked the closest bandit, overwhelming him with raw power. Then he surged forward like a projectile, tearing through the ranks one by one. His pace never faltered. In seconds, one bandit lay crushed, another hung by the neck in his grip. A blade raised over him didn't reach its mark. An arrow whistled through the air and struck the attacker before he could land a blow. Reynolds turned and acknowledged the shooter. Helen nodded without a word. The battle surged on. She continued eliminating targets with ruthless efficiency, her eyes blazing with rage. Adam didn't fall behind either. With a sharp cry, he surged forward and drove his blade through one of the largest bandits. His breath came heavier now, dust swirling beneath his feet. Another bandit appeared, a man covered in rings with a whip in hand. He cracked it forward. Jasmine dodged at the last moment, leaving him to strike down his own allies. She landed calmly, unfazed. He advanced, grinning, and warned her to stop resisting. He claimed he would teach her a lesson she'd never forget, one that would make her beg to stay. She met his eyes for a brief moment, then he lashed out again. Though she dodged, the whip grazed her face and struck her hand. Still, she stood tall, unwavering. Arthur, watching closely, realized she was at a disadvantage. His hands trembled. He turned toward the cart. Could he do anything with this body? Could he protect anyone? Just as the thought crossed his mind, something massive smashed into the cart. Wood splintered as it shattered. It was Reynolds. He had been flung through it, his body bloodied, mouth dripping red. Alice and Arthur rushed toward him, panic clear on their faces. Arthur turned sharply and saw the cruel man again. He recognized him instantly as the one responsible for his father's condition. Desperation filled his voice as he shouted for his mother to heal Reynolds. Alice turned toward him, tears in her eyes. Something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she whispered that she couldn't. Arthur didn't understand. Why wouldn't she help? Reynolds raised his head slowly. Despite the blood, he smiled gently and insisted he was fine. He said the wound wasn't fatal and that Alice should remain calm and do what she could. Arthur, still shaken, looked around in fear. Reynolds called to him. There was weight in his voice. He explained that once Alice began casting her healing spell, the enemy would come for her. He could hold them off, but not protect both her and Arthur at once. Therefore, Arthur needed to take his mother and return along the path they came from. He must not stop. Fear built up in Arthur's chest. His voice cracked as he refused. He didn't want to leave his father behind. He insisted he could fight. Everyone knew how strong he was. Reynolds smiled again. He placed a hand gently on Arthur's head and leaned close. He whispered that he knew his son was strong. That was why he trusted him with this. He needed Arthur to protect Alice. Blood poured from Reynolds' mouth as he added that it wasn't just Alice who needed protection. There was another life now, one still growing inside her. Arthur remembered the way Reynolds had placed a hand on Alice's stomach. He recalled how Alice had felt unwell during their travels, saying she was simply tired. Only now did the truth settle in. His mother was pregnant. Reynolds had meant to explain everything once they reached town. Arthur had gripped his father's hand tightly and looked up, vowing to protect her. While Alice healed Reynolds, Arthur turned to the side and warned his father to prepare. Reynolds, still grimacing in pain, explained there were 4 mages among the enemies. At that moment, the bandit leader raised his voice, furious that a healer was among them. He ordered his men not to let her escape. Arthur grabbed his mother's hand. Despite her resistance, he insisted they run. He glanced back with a hardened stare, thinking only that Reynolds would survive. From ahead, Adam raised his hand and urged them to move quickly. His voice was sharp with urgency. A bandit charged in pursuit, but Reynolds intercepted him, throwing himself into the fight to give them time. Steel clashed as the two engaged. Arthur and Alice fled through the trees. One of the archers targeted them. Arthur sensed the danger and turned just as the arrow flew. He raised his sword, catching it with the blade. The impact shattered the weapon, breaking it in two. Still, the arrow had been stopped. The attacker barely registered what had happened before a counterattack took his life. Helen, watching from nearby, shouted for Arthur not to stop. They pressed forward, running beside Alice. As they moved, Arthur's instincts told him something was wrong. He tried to track the mages. Adam was fighting one, Reynolds another. The third had fallen, but the fourth remained unseen. The bandit leader, nearly defeated, changed strategy. He barked out an order, demanding they abandon the plan and kill them all. Arthur scanned the area in confusion. A shadow appeared above. Arthur's eyes widened. The fourth mage had arrived in the air, his presence overwhelming. Without hesitation, he formed a swirling vortex. A surge of water spiraled downward. Arthur realized he could dodge, but Alice would never move in time. His anger boiled into action. He planted his feet, whispering a silent apology to his mother. At the last moment, Arthur shoved Alice out of the way. The water crashed into him, soaking everything. He held steady and threw a hidden blade through the vortex. It found its mark, piercing the mage's knee. In the same moment, Arthur activated a magical thread that linked him to the blade. He launched himself upward, gripping the invisible tether. His hands trembled and his boots scraped against the cliff face. His body rose higher, lifted by sheer determination. The mage, now wounded and staggering, reached the edge. Arthur did not hesitate. He seized the moment and let go. Both of them plummeted together. Durden saw what had happened. Without delay, he summoned a massive hand of stone and sent it crashing downward. Arthur fell with tears in his eyes. Thoughts of Alice and Reynolds flashed through his mind. In that final moment, he hoped they would be safe. As the ground rushed up, one thought filled him completely: he had always wanted to be a big brother. Morning light slipped through the curtains of a quiet room. Arthur awakened as his former self, King Grey. He sat silently on the bed, then rose and moved toward the door. When he opened it, a girl stood waiting with a plate. He stepped out and made his way through the hallway. The servants greeted him, offering polite morning wishes. Without slowing his pace, he continued down a broad corridor and entered an unfamiliar chamber. It was the office of an old man, who was surprised to see him. Inside, he stood with his back turned, eyes fixed on a large portrait hanging on the wall. The painting depicted 3 figures: the council responsible for managing the nation's affairs, controlling its politics and economy. His eyes shifted to another portrait, one of the king himself. In a world strained by dwindling birth rates and limited resources, wars had evolved into regulated duels between armies led by kings. He was one of them. The old man turned and asked Arthur whether he admired the portrait. Rising from his desk, he remarked that serving on the council had its benefits, though he would not pretend he was above envying the fame and recognition kings earned through victory. He stepped closer and asked what business brought King Grey to him. He said nothing. He reached for the medallion around his neck, removed it, and placed it on the desk. Without a further word, he turned and left, stating that he was resigning. Outside, he paused. His hand rested on his forehead. His entire life had been shaped by the pursuit of strength, yet he now questioned its worth. Fame and glory had never filled the emptiness left by the absence of those he had loved. He was still an orphan, still alone. Memories of firelight flickered in his mind, those quiet nights with his squad, laughter shared beneath the stars. He would have traded everything to see them again. Dawn crept across the land. Arthur lay in a garden, confused and bruised. His eyes opened slowly, trying to make sense of where he was or how he had survived. To his side lay the mangled body of a bandit, broken and bloodied. The sight made his stomach turn. He rolled away and vomited violently, the sound echoing through the trees. Now lying not only in torn clothes but also in mud and crushed leaves, he blinked into the morning light. A soft petal drifted down onto his face. He brushed it away and lifted his trembling arm. Slowly, he rolled onto his stomach, his body racked with pain. Nearby, he saw a cluster of berries. Crawling toward them, he snatched one with effort, devouring it quickly. Water followed, gulped from a flask. He tossed the container aside and looked at the sky until exhaustion forced his eyes closed once more. In his mind, he gave quiet thanks for the small comfort. Birds called overhead as he opened his eyes again. He tried to rise, failed, and collapsed back to the ground. He exhaled slowly, eyes shut again, barely clinging to memory. His small frame lay still, his core faintly darkened by energy. Moments later, a sudden surge of will pushed him upward. Pain surged through him, yet he managed to stand. Turning his head, he spotted a dagger embedded in a fallen bandit's back. Gripping the hilt, he yanked it free with such force that he fell back, landing seated in the dirt. Looking up, he saw the sheer cliff he had fallen from. Its height was staggering. He had no idea how he was still alive. Unsure how much time had passed, he pushed himself up and found a stick for support. Around him, the forest loomed. Survival was all that mattered now. As he took a step, a voice called out, asking if he was awake. The sound jolted him. Arthur spun around, his heart racing. Arthur turned sharply, instinctively preparing to strike. Panic filled him as he ducked behind a tree, staring at the lifeless body of the bandit. For a moment, he believed it might be his own. Before he could think further, a voice echoed the question he had just asked himself, how his body was feeling. He glanced away, uncertain and uneasy. A thought crossed his mind. What if the bandit stood up again? Tensing, he charged the corpse with a stick, only to hear the voice reassure him that the body would not rise. It would stay dead unless he willed it otherwise. Although this brought slight relief, the presence of the voice unsettled him. He scanned the surroundings but found no one. The voice, calm and dignified, offered no visible form. Arthur held up his dagger and demanded to know who it was. He asked if the unseen speaker was the one who had saved him. Just then, a rabbit burst from a nearby bush, catching him off guard. He looked to the sky, unsettled, while the voice stated he would understand everything once he returned home. Arthur found the confidence of the speaker suspicious. Still, the voice insisted it was the only one capable of returning him from this place. A wave of fear washed over him. He thought of home, of Alice, his mother, of Reynolds, his father. He wondered if they had made it to the city safely. Memories of his mother's kind face calmed him. He lowered the dagger and moved forward with determination, although his body still ached. A fit of coughing broke the silence. Embarrassed, he asked if he could pose a question, and if the voice might grant him the honor of meeting in person. The voice laughed, a booming sound that sent birds scattering through the trees. Arthur looked up. The voice teased that he was catching on quickly, though it found it slightly rude to be called Mr., considering it was not male. Despite the correction, the voice acknowledged his intuition. Arthur was stunned. He wondered how it knew his name. At that moment, a strange sensation surged through his body. His vision distorted, and the forest twisted around him. Rocks shifted from their resting places. Overwhelmed, he clutched his head and crouched low, breathing heavily. The voice advised him to leave immediately, warning that daylight would not last forever. As his condition slowly improved, thanks to scattered herbs and time, he gathered himself and pressed on. By midday, Arthur climbed onto a massive tree root, reflecting on the unknown magic that had saved him. He wondered how the voice knew about the fall, or why it had even acted at all. The more he searched for logic, the more questions arose. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears. Alert, he searched around a rock. His heart raced with anticipation. Relief followed when he discovered water. He stripped off his torn clothes and plunged into the stream. Water splashed in all directions as he scrubbed his body and clothes. His peace was short-lived. The voice returned, commenting on how carefree he looked. Alarmed, he scrambled to cover himself, which only made the voice laugh again. It claimed there was nothing worth hiding, which only worsened his embarrassment. Upset, Arthur pulled on a ripped shirt. He told himself to remain calm, reminding himself that these were just words. The voice apologized, asking not to be taken seriously. Arthur collected water into a flask, ate some berries, and estimated his location. The mountains lay eastward, placing him near the Alpha region. He studied the sky. The sun was falling fast, yet no fog had rolled in, which was unusual for this forest. Barefoot, he forged ahead. The deeper he went, the more he realized the glades were not as dangerous as he feared. Only small creatures occupied the space. Oddly, he had not encountered a single mana beast, which puzzled him. This forest was known for its abundance of mana. It disappointed him that he could not linger to absorb it, but urgency drove him forward. Thoughts of Alice filled his heart. She was pregnant, and the stress of his possible death could threaten the child. He hoped with all his strength that they were safe. Dusk fell, the voice returned, expressing joy that he had survived the ordeal. Arthur looked toward a rock, then glanced at a bird above it, responding with gratitude for the guidance. The rock in front of him shifted, revealing a faint crevice. The voice explained it was not the rock that had spoken, but that he must pass through the gap. A faint glow flickered inside. Arthur hesitated, swallowed, and stepped into the dark passage. Every thought centered on one truth: he had to return to his family. His journey home had only just begun. Inside the dark cave, the boy moved cautiously toward a distant glow. A voice warned him to tread carefully, though the caution came too late. The stones beneath him gave way, and he plunged downward. The fall seemed endless, his body caught in freefall for what felt like an eternity, until he finally crashed to the ground. Pain shot through his cheek as he landed hard. He clutched it, weary of the constant punishment his body had endured. A warning about a 2-floor drop would have been appreciated, he thought bitterly. Pushing himself upright, he tilted his head back and stared upward, his eyes widening in disbelief. Another stone suddenly disappeared beneath him, sending him tumbling again. He turned, heart pounding, and froze in horror. A towering stone figure loomed behind him. Horns curled from its head, and its immense form was unmistakably feminine. She addressed him directly, her voice calm despite the weight of her presence. Dust stirred around her as she stood, her thick limbs shifting the air. Her large clawed feet clung to the ceiling with unnatural ease as she advanced. Paralyzed by fear, the boy gaped. The voice chided him gently, warning that bugs might fly into his open mouth. Snapping his jaw shut, he stiffened as the stone woman narrowed her eyes and extended a hand. Tentatively, he reached out and grasped her massive claw. She explained that she needed time to open a spatial rift. He was strong enough to return home through it, but it would not be immediate. Pointing to the glowing plants nearby, she told him they were special and that they would help sustain him while they waited. He bowed his head slightly in gratitude, then turned to examine the plants. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable. The berries reminded him of fruit his parents once shared with him. The memory brought a heavy sadness. He tried to shake it off, forcing the thoughts away. The stone woman reappeared beside him and knelt on one knee. She plucked one of the berries and tasted it, remarking that it was much better when one wasn't afraid. He mimicked her, biting into the fruit. Juice splashed across his face and shirt, darkening the already dim surroundings. They sat together in silence, sharing the fruit. After a moment, the boy glanced at her, unsure how to address someone like her. He summoned the courage to speak and asked for her name. She responded calmly, introducing herself as Sylvia. He nodded, then asked if she would mind answering a few more questions. She agreed, though warned that not all answers could be provided. Slowly, his fear began to fade. He asked her everything that had weighed on his mind since his arrival: where he was, what this place was called, why she lived here alone, where she came from, how she had been injured, and why she had saved him. Sylvia began by answering the first. The place was a narrow zone hidden between the Beast Glades and the Elshire Forest. She revealed a map, explaining that no one else knew of it because she ensured its secrecy, keeping intruders away. Very few had stumbled upon it, and he was the first to ever truly enter. The boy scratched the back of his head and admitted she could call him Arthur, though his family often used a shorter, more affectionate version of his name. Sylvia leaned in slightly and assured him she would use it from now on. She continued, explaining that she remained in solitude because she had no one else. Her enemies, countless and relentless, sought the power she guarded. She gestured to the wound on her body and revealed that it was inflicted during her last battle. She had barely escaped alive. He listened intently, his eyes fixed on her. Sylvia went on to explain her reasons for saving him. Perhaps it had been his bravery. Perhaps it had been her loneliness. She admitted she could not decide between the two. Rising to her feet, she apologized. Night had fallen, and she needed rest if she was to resume work on the spatial rift by morning. The boy nodded solemnly and wished her good night. As he watched her retreat to her stone throne, he felt a deep sadness. There was something incredibly lonely about her presence. Before disappearing completely, she paused and turned back. She mentioned that her vision could not extend far enough to reach the place where his family had gone. However, she smiled gently and reassured him that both his family and his friends were safe, in case he had doubts. Relief surged through him. His lips trembled, and emotion welled up in his chest. At last, he could believe they were truly safe. Overwhelmed with joy, tears filled his eyes. A small smile formed, warm and genuine, as he let them fall freely. Time moved steadily as Arthur spent his days with her. He played while Sylvia watched, sometimes helping him gather berries or guiding him with her magic. They often rested in silence, their moments of connection growing deeper. Though their conversations were light, they rarely touched on the past. When not working on the portal, Sylvia sat in meditation and occasionally shared small insights with him. These hours flowed into days. The days formed weeks. Arthur grew used to her presence. Though strange and towering, Sylvia never brought fear. Instead, she brought calm. She never spoke about her life before meeting him, which puzzled him at first. Gradually, he understood that she carried something heavy within, something she had long learned to hide. Yet in every action, she showed patience and warmth. One afternoon, Arthur sat at a corner in the cave, eyes closed, drawing energy from around him. When he opened them, he saw Sylvia with the plants, gently picking fruit. Despite her monstrous form, she resembled no beast he had known. She held out a berry and asked if he had eaten. These fruits, she explained, were rare and nutritious. He accepted the gift and sat beside her. Something about her reminded him of Alice, gentle, thoughtful, always watching over him. The memory of his mother brought a faint smile, until harsher memories returned. Arthur recalled a darker time, when kindness had been answered with cruelty. Faces of those who betrayed and hurt flashed before him. His brow tightened, rage began to stir within. A massive finger flicked his forehead, knocking him to the ground. He sat up, clutching his head, and turned to see Sylvia settling beside him. She looked at him with measured calm, admitting that perhaps the ones who hurt him did deserve punishment. She revealed that she had once chosen not to save a mage for a similar reason. Yet before Arthur could ask further, she grew quiet. Instead, she warned that hatred would only weigh him down. To move forward, he needed a clear heart. Sorrows, anger, loss, they would eat away at him if he allowed them to take root. She encouraged him to learn from what had passed, not be consumed by it. Arthur listened. Her voice carried something more than wisdom, it held pain. She lay beside him and rested a hand on his head. Her tone softened, asking if he had been hurt by the flick. He gave no answer, simply reached for a fruit and began to eat again. Her wound, still bleeding faintly, caught his attention. She shifted slightly and assured him it would sometimes fester. He should not be alarmed. She then lowered her gaze and asked something unexpected. Most humans awaken to mana at 12 or 13, yet Arthur had already formed a core capable of complex control. She asked how that was possible. He simply replied that his parents called him a genius. Sylvia gave a soft laugh and embraced him. She believed he could learn something special. Arthur tilted his head, curious. She moved away, then shouted across the clearing. She explained that absorbing mana during movement, even in battle, was difficult. Still, it was possible. Humans, she said, often learned it late, making it harder for their bodies to adapt. Arthur looked at his hands, confused by what she meant. He clenched his fists, searching for sensation, but found none. He admitted the concept seemed simple when explained, yet difficult in practice. Sylvia reminded him that beasts learn naturally. His early awakening meant he was different. With training, he could master it. His hands tightened again. This time, something inside him shifted. He promised to give it everything he had. Sylvia laughed and said she expected nothing less. While she gathered energy for the portal, Arthur trained. He stumbled often. He fell more than he succeeded, but he never stopped. Sylvia laughed whenever he tripped, her voice echoing like distant thunder. Together with his wand, Arthur repeated his movements. Strike, step, focus, direct the flow. Sweat streaked down his cheeks. His arms trembled, yet he kept going. At one point, he raised his stick, extended it, and saw something shimmer across his fingers. Energy flickered, barely visible. He stared in disbelief. Before he could speak, Sylvia cried out. She praised him, everything had worked. Then her body slumped forward. She no longer moved. Blood stained the rocks beneath her. Arthur froze, dread gripping his chest. Time slowed as Arthur rushed to Sylvia's side. Her blood soaked the ground beneath them. His feet were already stained red by the time he knelt beside her. Desperation clung to him while he tried to turn her over, channeling what little energy he had left. A loud pulse echoed from the portal behind them. The wound on her body bled faster. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stared helplessly. It dawned on him that the injury worsened because she was pouring everything into maintaining the portal. Images flooded his mind, how she once fed him berries, their hours of training, the way she laughed, the first time she startled him. Those memories blurred as the present took over. He collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the reality. She was getting weaker because of him. Her sacrifice was meant to send him back to his family. His fists clenched. The pain in his jaw from grinding his teeth deepened as his grief spilled out in tears. Sylvia reached for him and gently brushed his hair. She said things would be fine. Arthur held her hand tightly, unable to form words through his sobs. Her condition worsened, yet she still smiled at him. Outside, the portal continued to grow. Sylvia asked if he had calmed down. Arthur shook his head. His sobs persisted. She pressed her hand to her chest and explained that their time was short. She begged him not to carry this guilt. Arthur wiped his face, struggling to stay composed. He confessed that it was hard not to blame himself when she was giving everything for him to see his parents again. A small smile curved her lips. She told him it was a favor. Leaving this lonely cave had always been her desire. Her fingers began to glow, shifting into molten light. She admitted the name Sylvia never suited this form. Her body shimmered and changed. White wings stretched open. Her fur gleamed. A majestic white dragon now stood before him. Arthur shielded his eyes from the glow. When he opened them, her purple eyes stared into his. She said this form felt more like her true self. He could barely comprehend what stood before him. She affirmed that people called her a dragon, but they had no time to dwell on that truth. Her voice turned urgent. Now that her disguise had vanished, danger was close. As the portal flared again, she covered him with a wing and instructed him to listen carefully. Then she offered him a multicolored egg. He stared at it in awe, surprised by its light weight despite how heavy it felt in his arms. She pulled a feather from herself and told him to wrap the egg in it to conceal its presence. He tried to understand, but her instructions came quickly. She nudged him with her nose, placing a magical seal on his body. It burned into his skin with searing pain, leaving symbols across his hand. He gasped through the agony. She told him the seal would activate when the time came. Her breath grew weaker. Arthur leaned closer, asking if she was all right. She smiled faintly and told him she would now finish the portal. She admitted there was no time to choose a precise destination. He would land somewhere near his parents. The boy's heart sank. She was fading, and nothing could stop it. Stones cracked from the ceiling. The cave trembled. Aurora flared above them. Sylvia shielded him again. A voice echoed from the shadows. A stranger appeared, resembling her former monstrous form. Horned and cloaked in power, he demanded that she hand Arthur over in exchange for healing. Arthur glared, recognizing something familiar in the figure. The stranger accused Sylvia of causing too much trouble by hiding. Sylvia's energy surged one last time. She confessed she had dragged out the spell to spend more time with Arthur. Her body trembled from exhaustion. She apologized, then made one final request. She asked him to call her grandma. Arthur's lip quivered. He held her wing, pleading with her to escape with him. He begged over and over, promising they could leave together. Her eyes welled with tears. She whispered that she could not. Tearing away her wing, she gave her final farewell. In the same breath, she flung Arthur into the portal. His scream echoed through the collapsing cave. He cried her name, reaching toward her vanishing figure. As the portal closed behind him, the last image seared into his mind was of her, sitting peacefully, smiling through tears. He had shouted that she was his grandma. She had thanked him with her final breath. Back in the cave, her tear-streaked face remained still. The portal disappeared. The berries around them shimmered more brightly than ever. The fruits rested quietly, and glowed faintly with her warmth. She had thanked Arthur and called him her child. Arthur awoke outside with the wind brushing across his face. Grass cushioned his back as sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above. Slowly, he turned his head and frowned. Towering trees surrounded him, their leaves rustling quietly. His jaw tightened with the realization that she was gone. Sylvia had vanished from his life. He clenched a handful of grass, grief swelling in his chest. The chance to see her again no longer existed. He struck the ground with his fists and cried out. A flock of crows burst from the treetops, cawing as they scattered into the sky. The morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Arthur shielded his eyes and let his thoughts drift back. 4 months had passed, yet it felt both brief and eternal. Those days had shaped him. Sylvia had treated him like family, offering the warmth and guidance he lacked in this world. Suddenly, a rhythmic thump echoed through his mind. Startled, Arthur sat upright. Confusion flickered in his eyes as he lifted his hand. A familiar voice resonated within him. Sylvie greeted him. His heart skipped. The sound wasn't imagined. Her voice, soft and steady, continued. If he could hear this message, then she had revealed her true self to him before parting. The memory of her nuzzling his body surfaced. It had been her way of leaving something behind. Arthur lowered his head in quiet sorrow. Her voice returned, explaining that he still wasn't ready to know the full truth. Her image materialized before him, shimmering faintly. She reminded him that, despite his advanced soul, his body was still that of a 4-year-old boy. His core had reached the dark red stage, yet his strength was limited. His fingers gripped his clothing. Sylvia's voice promised that she had embedded a gift within him, one that could influence his future growth as a mage. Although he hadn't asked for it, she hoped he would make use of it in time. A stream of mana rose beside him. Her tone softened, acknowledging the sorrow, guilt, and frustration he must have felt. However, she urged him not to forget the family he still had and the purpose waiting in this life. Nearby, a glowing white bundle caught his attention. Its aura pulsed gently. She hoped he would embrace his youth, find joy in innocence, and grow into someone worthy of pride. As he reached for the bundle, she added that when his mana core surpassed the white stage, she would speak to him again. For now, it was goodbye. The forest fell into silence as her final words echoed in his ears. She called him King Grey. Evening descended. The questions she left behind tormented him. How long had she known his true identity? How had she discovered it? Arthur tucked the mysterious bundle into his bag. One truth remained. If he lived only for revenge, he would repeat the mistakes of his former life. He looked down, then faced forward with resolve. This life had to be different. He scratched his head, then pushed off the grass. His bare feet found balance. In a swift motion, he darted forward and climbed a tree. Holding onto a branch, he surveyed the forest below. Even with mana, his view remained limited. What was clear, though, was his location. He had landed somewhere deep within the Elir forest. Lowering himself to another branch, he leapt through the trees. As he moved, he recalled Sylvia's lessons on mana core rotation. Although his control remained limited, he could sustain it longer than before. The question of how he had arrived there lingered, but he pushed it aside. What mattered now was exploration. A small grin crossed his face. He thought of a monkey tail and considered how well he had adapted. A sudden scream cut through the air. Arthur froze and turned quickly. The voice seemed human, yet the way it echoed reminded him of an animal. He sprang forward, grabbing hold of a nearby trunk. A white carve appeared below. Something about it caught his attention. Dropping lower, he flipped down a few branches and pressed close to the bark, listening. Voices drifted up. Someone below was pleading. Arthur's ears twitched. A dull, gruff voice ordered others around. Several men gathered at the back of a cart. One mentioned it was time to leave the forest, with only a few days left. Another commented on the girl inside. His tone oozed with malice, referring to her as an elven child and predicting that her innocence would fetch a high price. Arthur remained silent, watching with narrowed eyes. Their words were vile. The leader silenced the group and demanded the girl be locked back inside. Arthur's grip tightened. His hand scratched the bark as his expression darkened. These men were slave traders. Arthur remained hidden in the trees, eyes fixed on the white-haired girl cradled in the man's arms. He had no idea how they managed to capture forest hounds, yet he understood clearly that taking one for himself could be his way out. He scanned the group and counted 4 slave traders. The number made him pause. Perhaps this was the right moment to release some of his pent-up frustration. Even though he longed to return home, a plan was still necessary. Branch after branch, Arthur climbed silently through the forest canopy. Attacking recklessly would accomplish nothing. For now, he observed the carriage below, deciding it would be reckless to strike immediately. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. Arthur kept pace with the group, his thoughts circling the danger. Engaging all 4 at once would mean suicide, even for him. Darkness fell, and the slave traders finally stopped to set up camp. Arthur settled in above them, folding his legs beneath him and letting his mana flow quietly. He waited, gathering strength for the right moment. His pupils glowed with blue light. The time to strike had arrived. Reaching for a nearby fruit, he plucked a seed and tossed it into the trees. Barking erupted nearby as forest hounds reacted to the disturbance. The traders turned toward the noise, annoyed and confused. One of the men stepped closer to the beasts, holding out meat in an attempt to calm them. Arthur descended quietly behind him, his feet soundless on the bark. The man raised an eyebrow, sensing something too late. Arthur landed and struck, slashing the man's neck. Blood spilled quickly. Arthur caught the falling body and retrieved a knife from the man's jacket. He glanced down at the corpse, grateful for the weapon. The wolves, now aware of their master's scent, tore the body apart. Another trader looked over his shoulder, noticing the sudden silence among the beasts. His drunken eyes narrowed as he staggered closer. The snapping of bones stopped him in his tracks. He stumbled upon his dismembered companion, horror spreading across his face. Before he could react, Arthur appeared behind him, silencing him with a clean strike to the throat. Wiping blood from his cheek, Arthur felt the toll. Fighting in this childlike body demanded more from him than expected. He had to finish before the last two awoke. A sudden banging came from the cart, followed by muffled cries. Arthur spun around, cursing internally. The noise had alerted the others. The final two traders rushed to investigate. Their leader, a tall, muscular man, asked about the sounds and the missing members of the group. As they spread out to search, the bald one noticed a shadow slipping by. He swung his sword wildly. Arthur blocked the blow and pushed off with his bare foot. He slid between the man's legs and delivered a devastating strike that severed his limbs. The commander, hearing the scream, ran toward the cart and found his ally writhing in pain. The injured man shouted that the boy was a mage. Realizing the value of the child before him, the commander dropped his sword and extended his arms, aura pulsing around him. He laughed, saying that Arthur might fetch even more profit than the little elf. He circled quickly and launched a surprise attack. Arthur barely dodged in time. The ground behind him split apart as the man's attack landed. Another blow came rapidly, forcing Arthur to throw a chunk of earth. The commander wiped blood from his cheek, annoyed. A mana-charged dagger flew at him. He caught it easily, cutting off Arthur's control. Arthur frowned, recognizing the gap in their strength. The man smirked and tossed the blade back at him, taunting him to catch it. Arthur shifted, bracing for the next move. The commander charged, landing a heavy kick to Arthur's ribs. Arthur hit the ground hard, groaning. The man mocked him, calling him a bag of gold. He reached down and lifted Arthur by the ankle, laughing cruelly. Arthur analyzed the attacker's aura. The man's blade felt like condensed mana. If wind magic worked this way, then fire should too. Arthur focused, gripping the man's wrist. A spark flared in his palm. The commander paused, staring. The light grew stronger. Suddenly, flames burst outward in a brilliant flash. The resulting explosion shook the area. Smoke filled the air. The commander staggered back, burned but furious. He raised his charred arm, insisting Arthur could not have survived. Through the haze, Arthur reappeared. He lunged and snatched his dagger. Swiftly circling behind, he stabbed the man through the throat. Blood poured freely as the commander collapsed. Arthur caught the falling blade and turned toward the last man, now wounded and on the ground. The bald trader begged for his life. Arthur's expression turned cold. He remembered the little girl's terrified voice and understood she must have begged the same way. Without a word, he approached the cart. Inside, the white-haired girl huddled in a corner, eyes wide with fear. Arthur softened his expression. He reached out his hand gently, reassuring her that she was safe now and that she could return home. Overwhelmed, the girl bit her lip and began to cry. The girl saw nothing around her. Arthur explained that some things were better left unseen by children. She tried to protest, pointing out that he too was a child, although he cut her off and insisted they move on. He instructed her not to remove the blindfold until he said so. Eventually, she noticed her legs beneath her. Arthur told her they had moved far enough. From under the bandage, she glimpsed part of his face. She stood with her gaze lowered until he told her she could look. When she did, she saw his full face. With a shy gesture, she raised her hands and thanked him. Arthur turned away, waved slightly, and said it had been nice meeting her. The girl clutched his clothing, looking up at him with worried eyes. She said he should not leave a sweet little girl alone in the forest and confessed she was afraid. Arthur gave her a small smile and said he needed to return home as well. He assured her those dangerous men would not come back for her. As he tried to free himself from her grip, he explained that elves should be safe in the forest. She quickly shook her head, cheeks pink, and muttered that animals only feared adults. Arthur sighed and touched his forehead. She added that her parents once said forest hounds and tree golems ate children. He threw his hands up and asked how long it would take to get to where she lived. The girl turned her head, embarrassed, and admitted that she did not know. Arthur exhaled deeply. She watched him with concern as he stepped away and told her to stay put. Smiling faintly, he added that he would grab some supplies and hoped their journey would not be long. The girl agreed with an uneasy smile. Arthur searched the scattered belongings left behind, gathering what he could for the road ahead. He checked the knife he had taken and reminded himself that no one knew how long this journey would last. He also needed to consider the return trip. Glancing at the carriage, he realized they would not be able to take it. That was probably for the best, given how sore his legs already felt from riding it. He cut the rope that had tied the forest hounds to the cart. Once free, he sheathed his knife and hoped that the elves had a way to return him to the human kingdom. Returning to the girl, Arthur presented her with some folded clothes he had found in the carriage. He figured they belonged to her. He also gave her a cloak, warning that the night air would soon grow cold. The girl thanked him with a smile. Arthur patted her head and promised to take her home. As morning light filtered through the trees, they continued walking in the general direction the girl indicated. Arthur tried to learn more about her as they traveled together. When he asked for her name, she introduced herself as Tessia Erlith, then asked for his. They stopped to rest near the base of a tree, and Arthur gave his name. Tessia asked how he had ended up in the forest. Arthur replied that it was a long story. She insisted they had time. During their journey, Arthur had to fend off a few creatures using only a knife. Tessia examined one of the insects they encountered, smiling brightly at him. Arthur summarized that he had been separated from his family. She asked if he came from the human kingdom, then hesitantly questioned whether it was true all human men were perverts with several wives. Arthur asked where she heard that, and she said her grandfather had told her. Later, Arthur excused himself. Tessia frowned as he walked off. When he returned, he remarked that surely even elves had some perverts, then asked if she even knew what the word meant. Tessia admitted she did not. Arthur climbed up a tall branch. They ended up talking about marriage customs and noble families, particularly those with multiple wives. While Tessia played with rabbits, Arthur set a trap. She shared that life in Eleanor was enjoyable. She spent most of her time with her guardians and grandfather, since her parents were busy. Once she awakened, she expected to receive a tutor for training, which excited her. Arthur acknowledged that the kingdom seemed to have a strong education system, assigning individual tutors upon awakening. He caught a rabbit with a guilty look and held a knife in his other hand. Overhead, birds flew through the canopy. Arthur commented aloud to himself. Tessia puffed her cheeks in mock annoyance. As evening settled in, Arthur roasted the rabbit over a small fire. Tessia asked what happened to the slavers. Arthur responded vaguely that they met a rather unfortunate accident. She asked if they might come looking for her again. Arthur reassured her that would never happen. Tessia smiled with gratitude and rested her head in her hands. As the night deepened, smoke rose from the extinguished fire. Arthur glanced at Tessia. She appeared drowsy. He told her to get some sleep. Tessia asked if he would rest too. He led her to the tent and told her he would stand guard outside. He sat in the grass beneath a star-filled sky. Above him, the constellations seemed to form the image of Sylvia. Arthur reflected that he wanted to understand what kind of wool she had left for him. From inside the tent, Tessia peeked out and asked if he was sure he didn't need rest. She mentioned that her grandfather told her never to share a bed with a boy, but she wouldn't report him. Arthur smiled and said he was fine. She closed the curtain, slightly disappointed. Looking down, she softly said she had remembered something. She explained that animals might attack if they saw him because he was still a child. Embarrassed, she added that this was why she wanted to invite him to guard the tent from the inside, purely for their safety. Arthur gave a gentle smile and accepted. Inside the tent, Tessia lay on her side. She declared that she wasn't afraid. Arthur responded that they should sleep for now. He sat beside her. Tessia reached out and grabbed the leg of his pants. Arthur noticed and gave a quiet smile. They both began to drift off to sleep beneath the sky, where countless stars shimmered above them. Arthur thought that Tessia had endured much and deserved a peaceful rest. In the morning, a light fog drifted through the forest. Rabbits crept toward the tent where the children lay sleeping. The girl rested her head on Arthur's knee. He slowly opened his eyes, already thinking of the journey ahead. The forest was unfamiliar, and time moved quickly, yet this felt like the only progress they had made. They continued walking through dense thickets. Arthur glanced back and caught the girl smiling shyly, her hand pressing against her chest. Her fear had softened since their first conversation, although it was clear she still did not fully know how to speak to him. Golden rays filtered through the trees. Arthur tried to keep a smile, but the constant worry about his family and the desire to return home weighed heavily on his mind. At camp, they built a fire. Arthur hammered pegs into the ground with quiet focus until the hammer slipped from his grip. He fell forward, clutching his chest. The pain from his unstable mana core surged without warning, making every step of their journey harder. Sweat rolled down his face as he knelt. The girl approached with concern, though he simply covered his face and gave a vague reassurance. She frowned but did not press further. Night fell again. Inside the tent, Arthur shook with pain, clutching his chest in silence. Morning arrived, and they resumed the journey. He smiled at the girl, trying to mask his growing discomfort. Suddenly, a group of wild animals emerged behind them. A knife struck a nearby tree, startling the wolves, who fled at the sight of the angry boy. Arthur gave a sheepish smile while the girl led them forward. As they moved deeper into the woods, another sharp pain coursed through his body. He slipped behind a tree, hiding as he clutched his chest again. These episodes were becoming too frequent. He glanced at the girl, who remained unaware. She kicked a rock absent-mindedly. Arthur sighed inwardly, realizing she would only become more anxious if she found out. By nightfall, she gently covered him with a blanket as he slept. The next day, the sun rose high above them. Their steps continued, though the girl began to notice familiar features in the landscape. A soft sigh escaped her lips. Although they were getting closer to her home, her stamina weakened quickly. Arthur took her bag and slung it over his shoulder without complaint. He kept walking, even as the pain grew worse. Despite his physical growth, the toll it took on his body was increasing. Hiding it became harder each day. His teeth clenched as another wave of discomfort hit. The girl caught the change in his expression and looked at him with concern. He offered a weak excuse and walked off, pretending he needed to relieve himself. Later, they returned to the tent and rested. As the sun rose again, the girl tugged gently at his clothes. She had something on her mind. Arthur turned to her. She smiled awkwardly and asked if she could start calling him by his nickname, just as his family had done. He nodded calmly. When she asked what the name meant, he exhaled, smiling gently. He told her that if she used it, he would be honored. They stood in a clearing. The girl teased him, saying he talked like an old man. Arthur responded that it was better than acting like a child who could not do anything without help. With a flustered look, she grabbed his cheeks and told him to stop talking. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared on the trunk of a nearby tree. They turned toward it. The girl raised her hand and pointed ahead, saying she saw something. Arthur replied dryly, listing moss, leaves, fog, and trees. The girl grinned, then pointed to his dirty cheeks. That night, they rested peacefully again. Despite the vast difference in their mental age, Arthur realized they had grown close. The girl began walking among the trees, gently touching each one she passed. Her face lit up with joy. Arthur asked what had happened. A tree nearby began to glow. The bark split open, revealing a shining interior. The boy stared in disbelief. The girl reached out to him with a bright smile and beckoned him to follow. Arthur fell forward as soon as the teleportation ended. The sensation left him disoriented, his body rejecting the sudden shift in space. Tessia poked his shoulder gently. Her face brightened as she declared they had arrived. Rising slowly, Arthur looked around. His eyes widened as he took in the towering structures and the strange tranquility of their new surroundings. They stood on a broad path leading toward a massive settlement. Elves observed them from balconies with cautious eyes. Arthur could only think of one phrase to describe it all. This was the untouched land of the elves. Although vague, the thought barely captured what stood before him. Streams of mana swirled like wind currents, creating a glowing vortex in the distance. The energy continued building in strength. Tessia extended an arm in front of Arthur, holding him back. A figure emerged from the dense mana mist. Knights clad in ceremonial armor bowed their heads the moment they recognized the princess. Arthur stared at them, puzzled. His eyes flicked toward Tessia, who seemed just as embarrassed. She gave a small nod, her cheeks flushed. One of the knights stepped forward. He placed a hand over his chest and explained they had come immediately after sensing the royal teleportation gate had been activated. A carriage pulled up behind them. The king and queen rushed out, their expressions marked by urgency. Tessia's mother called out, running to her daughter. Before Arthur could react, an elderly elf, former King Virion, descended from the same carriage, his gaze calm but penetrating. Arthur rested a hand on Tessia's back, gently encouraging her forward. She broke into a sprint and embraced her family. The king and queen knelt to receive her, wrapping her in a protective hug. Watching them, Arthur smiled. A quiet hope surfaced in his mind. He wondered if Alice and Reynolds would greet him the same way when they saw him again. The king, Alduin Aerolith, rose and offered Arthur his gratitude. He then invited the boy into their home, stating plainly that he wished to hear everything once Arthur had rested. His tone remained polite, but his eyes made it clear that the request was more of a command. Arthur bowed slightly and accepted. Tessia grabbed his hand. Her gesture drew attention from everyone nearby. Her voice carried joy as she said she wanted him to see many things. Arthur followed, still unsure what to expect from a royal palace. The gates ahead loomed large, guarded by stoic faces. Inside, the main hall opened up before him, decorated with subtle elegance rather than overwhelming splendor. He touched his head lightly, still unsure how he had ended up in such a place. The queen, Muriel Erlith, gestured to the maids, instructing them to clean the boy and guide him to a place where he could rest. Arthur placed a hand on his chest, thanking her while expressing a wish to speak before anything else. The king watched him carefully, while the queen sat beside Tessia. Guards stood behind them, and the old elf from the carriage had taken a seat at the table as well. Arthur was seated at the far end. Remaining respectful, he bowed and introduced himself. He explained that he came from a small town and considered it an honor to stand in the presence of the city's ruling family. Despite his composed tone, he thought privately that things would go nowhere if they continued to treat him like a helpless child. The king leaned forward. Despite Arthur's modest claims, the man admitted he found the boy surprisingly mature and well-educated. He encouraged Arthur to speak freely. Lifting his hand slightly, Arthur began recounting his journey. He started with a vague story about being separated from his family and later encountering bandits. While not entirely untrue, it omitted many critical details. As he described meeting Tessia, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The king slammed a fist on the table. His anger flared as he declared that he should have known the Slavers would be humans. Arthur asked him not to generalize. Lowering himself into a chair, he added that slavery was a profession, not a race. Virion halted the guards with a raised hand. His eyes narrowed as he questioned Arthur. He wanted to know what a child had done after seeing his granddaughter in chains. Arthur replied with quiet certainty. Though still young, he was a mage. He had destroyed the Slavers and rescued Tessia. A soldier stepped forward, his blade glowing with aura. He accused Arthur of lying. Virion silenced him with a sharp glare. The guard flinched, stepping back slightly. Rising from his seat, Arthur declared that Tessia had returned safely, regardless of their doubts. He looked directly at the king. In that moment, he revealed what mattered most to him. All he truly wanted was to return to his family. Tessia rose from her seat as soon as Arthur mentioned his departure. Alduin and Muriel exchanged quiet glances while Virion smirked faintly. Arthur scratched his head with an uneasy smile, admitting that a human probably should not remain in the Elven Kingdom for too long. He frowned, explaining that his family's safety came first. They needed to know he was alive. Alduin placed a thoughtful hand on his chin. He then bowed his head and acknowledged what Arthur had done. Not only had he saved their daughter, but he had also taken responsibility for her safe return. Muriel pulled her distressed daughter into a hug, trying to comfort her. Alduin then declared that Arthur deserved more than gratitude. A proper reward had to be given. He revealed a teleportation device and explained that the gate it controlled only opened once every 7 years, during the triracial summit. Arthur's expression shifted as he lowered his gaze. Realization settled in. 5 more years would pass before the next opening. Suddenly, Alduin added that the kingdom could arrange an escort to see Arthur safely back to his homeland. Arthur met the king's gaze, surprised by the offer. Alduin extended his arms warmly. He assured Arthur of their hospitality and noted that although some in the kingdom accepted humans, many still bore resentment from the war. A maid bowed deeply nearby. Alduin continued, saying Arthur was welcome to stay as a guest, and that preparations for his escort would be made by morning. Arthur placed his hand over his chest, grateful. Later, Arthur stood inside a pristine bathroom. He stared at it, exhausted, and stepped into the shower. Water crashed down powerfully, but the comfort vanished quickly. A sharp pain pierced his chest. He clutched it and bent over in agony, thinking the condition was worsening rapidly. Moments later, he sat on the couch, gripping a glowing object. He studied it in silence, uncertain of what to do. Thoughts of Sylvia stirred guilt in him. She could no longer help. A knock broke the silence. Arthur opened the door and found Tessia standing there. Without hesitation, she pressed her forehead against his chest. Her face tightened with emotion as she accused him of speaking coldly to her parents and then trying to leave without a proper farewell. Arthur gently placed his hands on her shoulders, denying any coldness. He explained that he had shown respect to her parents as royalty, then asked why she had never told him they were king and queen. Tessia only grinned playfully, sticking her tongue out in response. Arthur frowned, telling her not to laugh at him. Tessia crossed her arms and turned away, her voice trembling as she confessed she did not want him to leave. He was her first true friend. Her body trembled slightly. Arthur softened and pulled her into an embrace, calling her a stubborn princess before asking her to show him the castle. They walked through the halls. Tessia led him to her favorite part of the castle. As they passed a quiet garden, she told him that if he remained until spring, he would witness the full bloom of the flowers. She looked down with a small smile and added that he could at least see the glowing bees. Tessia beamed and picked up a few of the glowing insects, asking if he thought they were beautiful. Arthur watched her hands with curiosity and accepted the bees from her. However, something shifted in the air. A foreign object hurtled toward them at high speed. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed Tessia's hand and pulled her close. He caught a plastic toy midair, then spun around and lunged toward the source. With precision, he twisted the attacker's arm and struck with the toy. In the next moment, Arthur realized who it was. Xyrus stood there, unfazed, offering a faint grin. Arthur stepped back in disbelief, accusing the old man of attacking his own granddaughter. Xyrus shrugged off the concern, claiming it would likely result in no more than a scar. He doubted the toy could actually harm anyone. Arthur examined the object in his hand, puzzled. He began to suspect that he had been tested. Xyrus leaned in slightly, complimenting Arthur's swift reaction and natural instincts. He noted that Arthur had not only caught the flying object but used it effectively. Arthur's brow furrowed in disapproval. Xyrus continued, remarking that Arthur's mana control was rough, though it had been enough to defeat several slavers. Arthur thought carefully. Something felt off about the old man. Tessia placed a calming hand on Arthur's shoulder, asking her grandfather to stop playing games. Xyrus' expression changed as he questioned what she meant. He turned back to Arthur, reminding him that there was a reason for his visit. Arthur tensed, unsure what the old man intended. Xyrus crouched lower, voice quieting. He confessed that it had been a long time since he met anyone interesting. From behind his back, he drew a wooden sword and extended it forward. He invited Arthur to demonstrate what he was capable of. The wooden sword spun through the air before Arthur caught it cleanly. He shifted his grip, gave it a short swing, and launched forward. The blade aimed directly at Xyrus' neck, prompting Tessia to cry out in alarm. Her grandfather, unfazed, smirked as a blue aura began to ripple across his body. Arthur narrowed his eyes and rushed in again, stepping forward with a fresh strike. Xyrus stepped aside with ease, raised his arm, and moved to counter. Arthur turned his body quickly and blocked the strike, though the force still pushed him back. He felt the strength radiating from the old elf and mentally acknowledged just how vast the gap between them was. Another attack came swiftly. Arthur retreated, barely escaping a sweeping elbow that sent him skidding across the training ground. His sword clattered away. He recovered quickly, sprinted after the weapon, and retrieved it mid-run. Slashes followed in rapid succession, each one controlled by mana, each movement minimized for speed. Despite that, he could not land a hit. Xyrus blocked everything. Then came an opening. A figure darted behind the elder, drawing Arthur's gaze for a split second. He seized the distraction and launched himself backward to gain momentum. His feet struck the edge of a nearby platform, springing him into the air. While turning mid-flip, he drew his sword in a wide arc. The tip grazed Xyrus' forehead, leaving a red streak as the sword embedded itself into the ground. Arthur landed and rolled, breath heavy. Tessia rushed over, calling both their names in concern. Arthur sat up slowly and saw Xyrus on the ground, rubbing the wound. The elder muttered that he had perhaps gotten too cocky, underestimating his opponent. Tessia puffed her cheeks and pinched him. She scolded her grandfather for pushing Arthur too far and insisted that he stop. Xyrus chuckled and argued that if he had been softer, Arthur would never have made it this far. Arthur laughed as well, brushing dirt from his shoulder. He admitted it was an honor to be considered worthy of such a test. Xyrus' expression shifted, suddenly serious. He stared into Arthur's eyes and asked if he would accept an apprenticeship. Arthur froze at the offer. Tessia looked back and forth between them, unsure if she had heard correctly. Xyrus, still holding the cloth to his forehead, repeated his question. Arthur hesitated, questioning if he was truly serious. Xyrus raised a hand, signaling confidence in the idea. Arthur argued that he was human, unsure if that even made him eligible to stay in the Elven Kingdom. Virian dismissed the concern, stating clearly that no one would dare touch him while under his protection. He explained that although Arthur was already far ahead of most children, he could still be taught things beyond the reach of even Sapien's best mages. Arthur lowered his gaze. He expressed his uncertainty, explaining that he had no idea how his parents were doing, or if they even knew he was alive. Virian leaned forward and quietly offered him a chance to communicate with them, just enough for them to know he was safe. With a brief wave, he summoned the servants and instructed them to take Tessia in for rest. Then he pulled his cloak tighter and turned to Arthur once more. The urgency in his tone returned. He admitted that his impatience stemmed from something he sensed during their spar. He asked if Arthur had been experiencing burning pain near his mana core. Arthur's posture shifted as he instinctively touched his chest. He asked how Virian could have known. The old elf responded without hesitation, stating that the boy's confusion about the source of the pain was the issue itself. Virian continued by bringing up the will of the beast. Arthur remembered Sylvia and the strange vision she had once forced into his mind. He recalled the glowing pyramid she had shown him, where magical power was ranked from E to SS. Virian clarified further. Beasts powerful enough to reach those upper classes often passed on a fragment of their essence, their will, to either a chosen descendant or someone they were deeply bonded to. He did not ask how Arthur had encountered such a creature, but confirmed that the boy now held a power beyond what his body could handle. Arthur asked quietly if he now carried the will of a beast himself. Virian nodded. A translucent figure appeared above his shoulder, revealing the image of a Pegasus. He explained that once Arthur overcame the entity within him, he would earn the right to be called a beast tamer. Arthur listened carefully, eyes fixed on the spectral beast. Virian explained that the title meant nothing unless Arthur could control it. Only then would it become a gift rather than a curse. He crouched before the boy and placed a hand over his abdomen, near the mana core. He confirmed what Arthur feared. The power within him was too much. Returning home now would be dangerous. The will inside him had begun to clash with his body, threatening to tear it apart from within. If left unchecked, it would destroy him. The Pegasus in Virian's palm began to shatter. Small fragments broke away into the air, evaporating like mist. Virian's voice grew quiet. He warned that unless Arthur began learning to tame it soon, the power would consume him entirely. Arthur lay motionless with his eyes closed, a heavy weight pressing against his body. A dark silhouette loomed above him. He stared at the crooked smile on its face, trying to understand whether this monster symbolized the fears, burdens, or expectations he carried. Tessia sat on top of him, insisting he wake up. He turned away, asking the imagined monster for 5 more minutes. Her expression turned angry at being compared to such a thing. After successfully waking Arthur, Tessia chuckled, commenting on the messiness of his hair. Arthur responded by teasing hers. As he dressed, Tessia asked if he would really be staying. Her grandfather had apparently told her that morning. Arthur admitted he was unsure and explained he would know more after a ride with the elder. Tessia suddenly pinched him. She shouted with a frown, insisting that he call her by name, not by title. Arthur quickly promised to remember, then asked for privacy in the bathroom, warning her to leave if she didn't want to be thrown out. Tessia called him a pervert. He, annoyed, told her to stop using words she barely understood. As he descended the stairs, voices filtered through the open door. Alduin argued that a human man living in their kingdom was inappropriate, despite his gratitude for saving his daughter. It violated too many traditions. As Virian climbed into the carriage, he firmly stated that he liked Arthur and would accept no objections. Tessia nodded in agreement when her grandfather supported the decision. Alduin frowned, asking his father to reconsider. Virian remained unmoved, declaring that the boy would be under his direct supervision and that everyone needed to know. Arthur stepped outside and approached the carriage, smiling at the thought that the old elf truly seemed trustworthy. Virian scolded him for being late. The forest scenery passed slowly as the carriage rolled forward. Arthur turned to Virian and asked how much longer it would take, calling him grandfather. Virian noted his casual tone. Arthur smiled, admitting he was curious to meet the elder's mysterious friend. Tessia's head leaned against his shoulder. Virian mentioned she had been up early, worried about him. He reached up, gently stroking her cheek. He recalled how, as the kingdom's only princess, she had grown up isolated, often heard by those who pretended to be her friends. She had built walls around herself to cope. In the short time Arthur had been with her, she had laughed and smiled more than she had in years. Virian looked down, thankful. The carriage came to a halt. Tessia woke as the door opened. The 3 of them stepped out and approached a wooden cabin. Arthur paused at the door, filled with anticipation about this strange individual who had drawn the former king out to such a rural place. Virian lifted a foot and began banging on the door, calling out for the old witch to appear. The door swung open, an old woman emerged, clearly displeased by the noise, asserting that her hearing worked just fine. Virian pointed to her, introducing her as Rinnia Darkasan, an old friend and a powerful deviant. Arthur bowed slightly, expressing his pleasure at meeting her. She gestured for them to come inside, noting that they couldn't stand around all day. Inside, Arthur looked around at the books and artifacts. He thought that being a deviant must mean she practiced magic like his mother's, something outside the standard elemental framework. He wondered what kind of help she could offer. Seated at the table, he apologized for being impatient, explaining that Virian had said her magic could help him contact his parents. Rinnia glanced at Virian, commenting on how much he clearly cared for the boy. Sitting at the table, a vat placed at its center, Rinnia explained that she was called a Dior. Though deviant magic varied widely, it allowed her to see what others could not. She smiled, saying that Arthur was special, so special, in fact, that parts of his life were hidden even from her. Arthur looked up, surprised. He nodded when she clarified that her clairvoyance wasn't the reason they had come. Rather, she would help him see his parents and let them know he was alive. She lifted the vat of water and asked Arthur to lean forward and look inside. Holding her hand above his head, she instructed him to focus on the image of his parents as clearly as possible. Arthur closed his eyes. In his mind, he pictured his mother, her warm brown skin, glowing softly under sunlight, and her soft chestnut hair. He recalled her worried eyes, always filled with concern for him. Then his thoughts turned to Reynolds, with his sharp blue eyes and a wide grin that lit up even the dullest moment. He remembered the silly jokes, the carefree demeanor that contrasted with the strength and leadership he had always shown. A silent plea echoed in Arthur's heart. He wished for them to be alive. Slowly, he opened his eyes, peering into the water. His gaze widened as an image began to form. Steam curled above the pot as Alice stirred the hot soup. She offered Reynolds a taste, her smile gentle despite the heaviness in her eyes. He examined the stew, swirling his spoon slowly before taking a bite. The rich aroma hinted at something special, prompting him to ask if there was an occasion. Alice, after a short pause, replied that it had simply been a while since she last cooked for him. After helping her sit down, Reynolds kept a close eye on her. Her gaze lingered on the soup, sorrow etched deep in her expression. She thought about Arthur, remembering that beef stew had been his favorite meal. Her sadness did not go unnoticed. Reynolds leaned in, asking gently if something had happened. She exhaled, brushing her hand over her rounded belly, assuring him that all was well. A sudden voice echoed in their minds. Both parents froze. They exchanged a startled look, hearts racing. Arthur's voice called to them. Though faint and distant, it was undeniably their son's. The spoon in Reynolds' hand slipped, spilling soup onto the table. The boy's voice, calm yet emotional, admitted that this sudden communication must have shocked them. He promised to explain later. For now, he only wanted them to know he was alive and safe. Alice's breath caught, memories of her being held tightly before the fall returned. Arthur continued, describing how he had barely survived the drop from the cliff. His words trembled with emotion as he recalled the moment he knelt crying, overwhelmed by pain and helplessness. He told them he was now in the kingdom of Elenor, under the protection of the elves. Although it was supposed to remain a secret, he felt they deserved to know. He recalled the chaos of the moment, crowds gathered near carts, fists flying, shouts ringing out. Despite everything, he expressed how relieved he felt knowing his parents were alive. Images of Alice lying wounded, her body covered in bandages, filled his thoughts. He pleaded with them not to blame themselves for what had happened. His voice held no regret. Reynolds looked down, his sadness deepening. Arthur's words rang clear. He had no shame about his actions. If given a second chance, he would make the same choices, even if it meant his own death. Somewhere beyond the storm-covered mountains, a small tent shielded Alice and Reynolds from the rain as they listened. Arthur confessed that he longed to be with them. However, something unknown had taken root in him, an illness or condition he did not yet understand. For now, he needed time to heal. As the cart he rode neared the city gates, wide and towering, he reassured them once again that he was not in danger. Yet recovery came first. He explained that he might not be able to contact them again in this way. There were no guarantees. As Reynolds and Alice quietly left the others behind, heading toward a white door, Arthur spoke of a mage who had helped him reach out. She was a deviant like Alice, wielding rare and powerful magic. Thanks to her, they could hear his voice now. Inside the home, Alice was shown to their room. Arthur turned his thoughts to his father, promising to continue his magical training and combat practice during recovery. He warned Reynolds not to be surprised if he managed to defeat him in a future sparring match. Meanwhile, Reynolds bowed respectfully to those who had welcomed them and embraced his wife gently. Arthur ended his message with a request. He asked his father to take care of Alice and the unborn child. His words faltered as he expressed his love for them. On the table, the spoon lay untouched. Reynolds sat frozen, his eyes glistening with tears. Across from him, Alice reached for his hand, her voice barely steady. They both stood. Tears streamed down their cheeks as their son's voice continued. He asked them to care for one another until the day they would reunite. His final words trembled with emotion. Inside the wooden cabin, Arthur's reflection faded from the bowl of water. Virion, standing quietly nearby, observed him. Arthur wiped his eyes, a flicker of resolve forming behind them. His voice, now steady, declared that he was ready. The carriage returned to the palace. King Alduin and Queen Muriel stood at the entrance as Virion, Arthur, and Tessia stepped out. Before Arthur could move further, Alduin raised a hand to halt him. He spoke briefly, mentioning how years on the throne had made him stubborn and rigid. Muriel placed a gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder and leaned in, explaining softly that her husband merely wanted to apologize. She asked him to forgive what had happened and to consider this palace his home. Virion observed the scene silently. Alduin extended his hand and acknowledged Arthur as both his daughter's savior and the first student of the elder elf. He requested the honor of greeting him properly. Arthur accepted the gesture, shaking the king's hand with a soft smile. Before anything else could be said, a loud voice broke the calm. Tessia stepped in front of Arthur and firmly declared that if everyone was truly sorry, then they should allow them to go outside so she could show him the city. The king and queen exchanged a brief glance and permitted it. Tessia appeared quickly on the palace stairs, dressed in a light outfit and a pink hat. She cheerfully offered to guide Arthur through the city. As they walked together, Tessia pointed out different parts of the capital, speaking with excitement. Their walk was interrupted when someone touched Arthur's shoulder. Arthur turned, ready to apologize, but the blond boy behind him smirked instead. With a mocking grin, the boy scoffed at Arthur's politeness and remarked on his supposed inferiority. He accused Arthur of thinking he belonged here simply because the elder elf favored him. Arthur looked at him with quiet distaste while Tessia demanded that the boy leave them alone. Internally, Arthur noted that this boy was the kind of arrogant noble he had hoped to avoid. The blonde waved dramatically, thanking Tessia for her kindness while warning her against keeping company with a commoner. Introducing himself, he insisted that someone of his status, Faerith Ivsar III, should accompany the princess instead. Arthur asked if this was the same Faerith Ivsar he had heard about. Faerith smiled proudly, pleased that even a commoner had heard of his recent awakening. He then scolded Arthur for mispronouncing his name, calling him ignorant. Arthur suppressed his irritation. Tessia, barely holding back laughter, watched Arthur bow and offer a sarcastic apology. Arthur promised to show proper respect in the future and excused himself with a smile. As they walked away, Faerith shouted for them to stop. With a scowl, he accused Arthur of mocking him. Arthur smirked again, acknowledging to himself that at least the boy wasn't completely clueless. Faerith then raised a scroll and declared his challenge for a duel. Arthur stood frozen. Tessia stepped between them, scolding Faerith for daring to challenge Virion's apprentice. She reminded him that noble birth did not entitle him to act without restraint. Faerith apologized to Tessia while maintaining that he could not ignore an insult to his family's honor. He drew a cane from his side and demanded Arthur accept the challenge or step away in disgrace. He warned that refusal would also reflect poorly on his mentor. Arthur remained quiet. Faerith interpreted the silence as agreement. He then requested that Tessia act as referee. With an exasperated sigh, she stepped forward, raising her hand. Townspeople began gathering nearby, watching with interest. Once she lowered her hand, the duel began. Faerith raised his scepter and prepared to strike, but before he could move, Arthur appeared in front of him and landed a clean punch. Faerith collapsed to the ground. Arthur raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Tessia stood beside him and commented that she had expected this outcome. Grabbing his hand, she led him away, suggesting they flee the scene. Both of them laughed as they ran. Arthur couldn't help but admire her more. While the rest of the day passed quietly, they explored weapons, examined tools, and talked with shopkeepers. It was a welcome distraction. Later, the two stood on a stone balcony overlooking the city. Tessia smiled and asked if Arthur was nervous about his training tomorrow. Arthur remained quiet. His thoughts drifted to Virion and the words he had spoken. The old elf had warned that his lessons would not be easy. He had mentioned how the pain from mana training would be intense, and likened the assimilation process used by beast tamers to submerging one's body in boiling tar. Virion had pointed out that Arthur would be isolated in a foreign land without family, and that even daily life would be a struggle. Despite this, the elder's smirk returned when he added that if Arthur could endure it, the rewards would be immense. He had asked the boy if he was ready. Arthur responded with a confident wave. He clenched his fist and said that he was excited. He reminded himself how far he had come just to reach this point. His heart was set not only on improving himself, but also on returning to his parents. He longed to learn, to grow stronger, and to explore the kingdom even further. With that thought, the chapter of his arrival ended. So concluded the first season of his journey. 3 years had passed. Tessia called out to Arthur, brushing aside the strands of his brown hair. She tapped his leg and announced that everyone was ready. Squeezing his ankle without care, she shouted that they were already late. Arthur flinched and muttered in pain, realizing she had used mana to twist his ankle. Sitting up on the bed, he asked if she could find a gentler way to wake someone up. Tessia folded her arms, claiming that he should be thankful a beauty like her even bothered to come. Her mood soured when Arthur pointed out that there were plenty of cute maids in the palace. They descended the stairs. Tessia asked again if he truly found the maids attractive. Arthur changed the topic, suggesting she take a break. Virion stood waiting, weapons in hand. He commented on how long they had been gone and declared it was time to continue their lesson. There were 4 basic elements in their highest forms: ice, gravity, lightning, and sound. Only mages who had transcended mastery of their primary elements could manipulate such forces. These rare individuals were known as deviants. Turning to the kids beside him, Virion explained that dwarves could only manipulate earth or fire. However, their affinity for those elements far exceeded that of humans. Every dwarf had the ability to mold and shape metal. The gifted ones could even combine fire and earth to control magma. As for the elves, their elemental manipulation was limited to wind, water, and earth. Yet their affinity for these elements was far superior to that of other races. Occasionally, an elf would awaken as a unique deviant, gaining control over plant life. Even so, elves could not reach the highest forms of the basic elements. Humans were different. They could wield all 4 elements and had the potential to become deviants in any one of them. Some anomalies defied classification entirely, such as healers. Between the 3 races, a delicate balance of power remained, influenced by population size, natural affinity, and magical loyalty. Arthur sat on the grass, asking if the explanation had been clear enough. Virion stuck his sword into the ground and scratched his beard. He said that it would do. Tessia raised her hand, kneeling as she voiced her question. She understood the purpose of this training was to prepare Arthur's body for the beast's will, but wondered if he would benefit more by focusing on physical combat, as she had. Arthur smiled faintly. He already knew most of this from his lessons, but living among the elves had exposed the sharp differences between races. Among humans, early awakening was rare. Among elves, it was common to awaken shortly after the age of 10. Tessia's room had been destroyed years ago, her awakening coming even earlier, at 9. Tessia knelt and asked if all of this was really necessary. Arthur guessed she was still bitter from their earlier training match. She admitted it. Tessia looked offended. Arthur considered how her training had progressed. She was learning magic from a tutor and combat from her grandfather. At this rate, she would become a force to reckon with. Although he had no right to judge, he still thought of her as a future monster in battle. Virion ruffled Tessia's hair. He explained that Arthur's training had fused mana with every fiber of his muscles and bones, unlike Tessia, who focused on physical endurance. When this process ended, Arthur's body would surpass even that of a seasoned warrior. Tessia tilted her head and asked why he was still so weak to her hits. Arthur complained that he still felt pain. Virion smirked and said that apparently 3 years of fusion training had not drained all his energy. He asked if Arthur was ready. Arthur nodded. The old elf placed a glowing palm over the boy's chest and warned that the process might be warm but shouldn't be painful. Arthur tensed as his core filled with mana. His chest glowed, light piercing from within. A blast followed. Virion flew backward. Tessia was thrown aside. Silence fell. Elves ran toward the collapsed boy. Tessia rushed to his side, grabbing his hand, asking if he was all right. Arthur managed to speak. He said he was fine. Virion, still stunned, asked again what kind of beast had given him its will. Arthur looked up and replied it was a dragon. The elder froze. After a pause, he asked again, this time with disbelief. He repeated his words, barely able to comprehend what he had just heard. The truth settled slowly. Arthur had bonded with a dragon. Later, Arthur awoke in bed. Virion sat nearby, asking how he felt. Arthur, still weak, reminded him that the last thing he remembered was the elder's stunned expression. Virion nodded. He had since recovered. Arthur asked for his secrecy. He wanted no one to know about the dragon. Virion agreed. He then brought up Arthur's departure. The boy sat up in shock, thinking he had more time. He had assumed he would remain among the elves for at least 2 more years. Virion explained that in 4 months, an interracial tournament would open the portals to Xyrus and Darv. It would be his chance to leave. Arthur clenched his fists. Victory felt close. He asked where Tessia had gone. Virion placed a hand on his shoulder. He assured him she was fine. He also acknowledged Arthur had been secretly checking on his parents through Rhynia. That would no longer be necessary. Soon, Arthur would meet them in person. Arthur looked away. He murmured that 4 months seemed too soon. Virion ruffled his hair gently. He wished those months would pass quickly for him. Now that his training was complete, new challenges awaited. Virion stood and told him to rest. He would speak to Tessia personally about his departure. Arthur remained in the room alone. His gaze shifted to the side. Something had rolled off the couch. A multicolored egg lay near the floor. Cracks had begun to spread across its shell. Arthur stood frozen, his eyes locked on the egg. A sudden crack echoed, followed by a crunch. A fragment of the shell fell away, revealing a single golden eye staring back at him. Confusion set in as Reynolds hesitantly asked if Sylvia's stone had actually been an egg all along. From the cracked shell emerged a black-scaled creature. Its tail snapped through the remaining pieces, freeing its small body. The baby dragon shook its head, let out a loud cry, then collapsed into sleep as if the effort had drained it. Arthur tilted his head in curiosity. The tiny dragon mimicked him. He moved his head in the opposite direction, and again the creature mirrored his movements. Gently, he lifted it into his arms. The little beast beamed up at him with a smile. Reynolds, watching nearby, seemed quietly moved by the sight. The moment ended abruptly when the dragon suddenly bit Arthur's hand. Wincing in pain, he rubbed the spot and examined the mark. The creature let out a strange sound. Arthur shook his head, startled by the voice he had just heard in his mind. He looked around, then back at the dragon, which repeated the sound. Realization dawned slowly. He could hear it, not with his ears, but in his thoughts. He leapt onto the bed, wide-eyed. The dragon had spoken to him telepathically. Unsettled but intrigued, Arthur narrowed his eyes at the dragon beside him. He reminded the creature that he was a boy, so it should not call him Mom. Instead, he suggested, Dad. He gently stroked its head and thought about giving it a name. Sylvia had once protected him. Naming the dragon Sylvie felt right. He smiled as the dragon chirped in response. It seemed to approve. Arthur's cheeks turned red. He could feel the joy radiating from her, not just through her expression, but directly through their shared connection. Glancing at the bite again, he sensed that the mark left behind held more meaning than just a wound. A subtle bond had formed, one that tied him to this dragon. Lying back, he closed his eyes. He thought about how unusual this all felt. He was only 8 years old, and now he had a magical mark and a telepathic bond with a newly hatched dragon. He whispered to himself that he really was becoming a rebel. Not long after, the room echoed with a sharp noise. Arthur grimaced, then sat up in a daze, asking who was there. Tessia entered, holding Sylvie in her arms. She looked at the creature with wide-eyed affection and asked about her. Arthur turned his head, noting that it was already night outside. He lay back down and pulled the blanket over himself, trying to sleep once more. The following day, he walked through the palace hallway with Tessia. She looked at him with interest and asked if he could truly communicate with the dragon through thoughts. Pointing at herself, she wondered aloud if she could befriend it too. Arthur responded that Sylvie would probably like her, assuming she stopped staring at her like a predator. Further down the corridor, they were stopped by Virion. He asked to take a look at Arthur's new companion. Turning toward them, Reynolds noticed Sylvie's glowing yellow eyes and her tail. Virion leaned closer, dumbfounded. He pressed his hand against the wall and muttered that if he kept being this surprised, he might die early. Arthur explained what had happened and how Sylvia's will had been passed on to him. Virion listened carefully. He noted that such creatures typically only hatched in the presence of their own kind. Tessia and Virian soon joined the conversation. As the old elf debated with the girl, Arthur meditated silently. He began to wonder why Sylvie had chosen to hatch before him. Only one explanation came to mind: his recent full assimilation of Sylvia's will. Rising to his feet, he turned to Virian and asked if they would need to hide her when he returned to the human realm. Few would recognize the dragon's true nature, and most would underestimate her. Virian assured him it would be fine. He advised that Arthur simply pass Sylvie off as a rare magical beast. Squeezing the boy's shoulder, he added that there were more pressing concerns. Until now, Arthur's poison had been suppressed to avoid complications. Now that he was fully awakened, they would need to begin court training, both his and the dragon's. Arthur looked puzzled. He asked what he was expected to do next. Virian smirked, tossed aside his sword, and declared that the best way to unlock the first stage of his beast's will was through combat. Strengthening the mana core alone would not be enough. Arthur nodded, stretching his arms. The idea made sense. Before he could speak, Virian added another thought. Facing off against other beast tamers who had activated similar stages would also be beneficial. Arthur's jaw dropped as he processed the implication. Without warning, a rush of black energy gathered. Wind swirled through the clearing. Tessia covered her head. Arthur shielded his eyes. When the wind faded, a dark silhouette stood before them. Beast-like ears twitched on its head. Glowing yellow eyes stared back at Arthur. Virian had transformed. His expression remained calm as he proposed they fight. Beast tamers were mages gifted with the ability to channel powers inherited from mana beasts. The first stage, known as the acquisition phase, allowed a tamer to borrow the beast's innate strength. Only during the second stage, the integration phase, could a mage fully utilize the creature's unique traits and abilities. Virian stood with his arms outstretched. After decades of studying his own beast's will, he had finally achieved the second stage and could now wield the deadly power of the Shadow Panther. His figure radiated that strength as he turned to Arthur, who stood cautiously. The boy listened intently, unsure how to respond to Virian's warning about being caught unaware. Arthur clenched his teeth, uncertain if the old elf was serious about sneaking behind him. A moment later, Virian vanished. Arthur flinched as a hand landed on his shoulder from behind. Turning quickly, he found nothing in front of him. Virian stood at his back, calm and unmoved. Arthur lowered his hands and admitted defeat. Reacting to such speed had been impossible, and he remained stunned by the display. Virian reverted to his usual form, brushing off residual mana. He admitted that although this form was powerful, it came with flaws. Mastering the fusion phase remained beyond his reach. Arthur rubbed his neck. It was not just the speed that surprised him, but the inability to sense Virian's presence at all. Holding up his sword, Virian explained that shadow panthers manipulated wind and sound instinctively, making them nearly undetectable. He passed the sword to Arthur and asked how he felt about starting real training. The days that followed slipped by quickly. Arthur and Tessia meditated daily under Virian's supervision. With help from both the elder and his growing knowledge, Arthur accessed the first stage of the dragon's will. Virian also taught him how to suppress the presence of that power, concealing it from other mages. In training sessions, Arthur began sparring with Virian, grateful for the assimilation process that let his body continue improving even while resting. During his free time, he enjoyed being with Tessia, sharing moments that reminded him of the innocence of childhood. Eventually, the day of departure arrived. Tessia stood with tears in her eyes. Arthur stood across from her with the royal family. Every moment they had shared over the past years made saying goodbye increasingly difficult. Tessia sat quietly while Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. He gently smiled, thinking of the feather left by Sylvia. It helped conceal his mark's presence. A hand touched his other shoulder. Virian stood there, patting Arthur's head. The carriage had arrived. He handed Arthur a compass engraved with the crest of the House of Erelith. It would help him navigate through the forest. Arthur thanked him. The old elf mumbled that he could use it to find another princess if needed. Tessia yanked on Virian's beard, and he yelped. Arthur smiled softly, reassuring her that they would meet again and that her grandfather would continue teaching her. He hoped she would be stronger the next time they reunited. Tessia looked down. Arthur hugged her tightly and told her that he would miss her. She began to cry, embracing him as she whispered the same. At the carriage, Arthur waved and climbed inside. His expression was subdued. Inside, a familiar voice spoke. Xyrus, sitting with two other children, asked if he had been kicked out of the kingdom. Arthur blinked and asked who he was. The blonde pointed dramatically and claimed to be the nobleman Arthur had humiliated by defying duel customs. He added that real duels relied on magic, not brute force. Arthur stared blankly before slowly recognizing him. Leaning closer, he apologized for bullying him in the past. Xyrus looked away. The purple-haired girl beside him cheerfully told Arthur to call him Feifei like the rest did. Xyrus protested loudly, demanding that no one else repeat that. Arthur watched the two argue as the rest of the children in the carriage laughed. The laughter felt warm and natural. Outside, the carriage wheels groaned on the dirt road. Arthur heard the coachman's voice call out their arrival. He leaned toward the window, staring ahead. In front of them stretched a vast city, suspended in the air. Xyrus, the floating capital of magic, loomed in the distance. The streets of the city buzzed with activity as people filled the walkways, their voices mingling with the hum of daily life. The sun cast its light on a pristine white building where two carriages slowly approached. Arthur stood before it, hesitating briefly at the door. With his hand raised, he paused as if asking Sylvia whether it was time to return home. The boy knocked, recalling the pain of his past, the injury he had endured, and the loss of someone important. Despite his training and will to survive, nothing had made him feel as nervous as he did in that moment. A child's voice called out from within, prompting an elderly woman to open the door. Arthur introduced himself politely, explaining that he had been told his family now lived there. A young girl peeked out from behind the woman, hiding shyly. Alice descended the stairs quickly, calling out to her daughter. The sight of her son stopped her in her tracks, and the plate in her hands slipped to the ground, soup spilling across the floor. Arthur looked down at the mess, then met the gaze of the little girl. A quiet smile formed on his face as he wiped away a tear. He told his mother he was home. Overwhelmed with emotion, Alice embraced him tightly as tears streamed down her face. She kept repeating that she knew it had been him, and now he was truly back. Her daughter tugged gently at her dress, asking her not to cry. Reynolds rushed into the room, calling out Arthur's name. The elderly woman guided him to the right place, and he ran into the room, arms wide. He pulled his son and wife into a strong embrace, and Arthur finally allowed his tears to fall again. Their reunion brought them all to the floor in a tangle of hugs and sobs. Later, they sat on the couch together. Alice, unable to hide her concern, questioned Arthur about his condition. She reminded him that he had mentioned an illness before and asked if he had been eating properly. He assured her that he was doing fine and had never felt better. Reynolds laughed, suggesting that his wife asked too many questions. He said they could tell just by looking at Arthur how much he had grown. Ellie sat nearby with a dragon plush in her hands. Alice encouraged her to greet her older brother. The girl hesitated, wide-eyed, before getting off the chair. Alice placed her hands gently on Arthur's shoulders and reminded her daughter that this was the brother from the stories she told at bedtime. Ellie smiled and said hello. Arthur reached out, taking her hand, and expressed how happy he was to finally meet her. Their parents watched the scene quietly, both smiling. After settling in, Arthur took time to recount his story. He carefully explained what had happened since he fell from the cliff, though he left out details about Sylvia. He credited his survival to a mixture of luck and his body's unconscious use of magic. He spoke of his recovery in the Elf Kingdom, making sure to explain the events without revealing too much. When Reynolds noticed the creature perched on Arthur's head, he asked about it. Arthur explained that during his travels, he found the lair of a dying mana beast. Unable to save the mother, he chose to care for her child instead. Alice, still concerned, asked if there was any chance of the illness returning. Arthur reassured her, smiling confidently. He explained that the condition had mostly stemmed from the instability of his mana core due to awakening early. He looked down for a moment, guilt flickering across his face. It hurt to keep secrets from his family, but until he grew stronger, the truth would remain too dangerous to share. Reynolds, filled with pride and curiosity, asked about Arthur's current mana stage. Alice quickly scolded him, arguing that their son had just returned and deserved a moment of peace. Reynolds defended himself, insisting that comparing progress was normal. He gestured to a bandage on his arm, boasting that since arriving here, he had been working as a guard instructor for the Helstea family. Arthur smirked and joked about his father having grown more than just facial hair. Curious, he asked what stage Reynolds had reached. With a proud smile, Reynolds revealed that he had broken into the dark orange stage 2 years ago. Arthur nodded, impressed. He knew his father must have worked hard to achieve that milestone. Reynolds struck a triumphant pose, asking again what stage Arthur was currently at. The boy replied that he had reached light red. Reynolds froze, his expression darkening. He let out a string of curses, much to the shock of Ellie, who repeated the words innocently. Alice gave her husband a sharp glare and reminded him not to swear in front of their daughter. Reynolds immediately began apologizing to both his wife and Ellie. He then turned to Arthur, shaking him lightly and asking when he had reached that stage. Excited, Reynolds pointed toward the backyard, suggesting they spar right away. Arthur laughed heartily, watching his parents and sister with warmth in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly glad to be home. A brown-haired man with glasses burst through the door, his voice filled with urgency as he announced the news of Arthur's survival. His eyes scanned the reunited family before adjusting his glasses in disbelief. A woman and her daughter appeared behind him. Arthur quickly recognized them as the ones who had watched over his family in his absence. Reynolds stepped forward and introduced the visitors. Vincent Helstea, owner of the Helstea auction house, had been a close friend and now served as Reynolds' employer. Standing beside him was his wife, Tabitha. Reynolds asked Arthur to introduce himself properly before their reunion got too chaotic. Arthur bowed and greeted Mr. and Mrs. Helstea politely. He added that he had been the one to request secrecy about his existence and immediately apologized for the inconvenience it caused. Vincent responded by smacking Reynolds on the shoulder and asked Arthur if he truly was his son. Arthur simply replied that he often got that question. Tabitha placed her hands gently on her daughter's shoulders and introduced her as Lilia. She expressed hope that Arthur and Lilia could be friends since they appeared to be around the same age. Arthur gave a small wave. Lilia's attention quickly shifted to the dragon on his head. Her heart skipped a beat as she asked if she could pet it. Before receiving a response, Vincent recalled the sparring comment from earlier. His voice faltered as he questioned whether they were actually doing that. Reynolds and Arthur were already heading toward the grassy area outside the house, warming up their arms while the others settled in. Alice and Tabitha chatted on the steps. Lilia and Ellie played near the dragon, their laughter rising into the air. Tabitha tugged at Vincent's sleeve, asking if he truly believed Reynolds' claim. Alice admitted her own surprise but assured her that Arthur had always been a fast learner and had no reason to lie. Vincent remained skeptical. He crossed his arms and questioned whether an 8-year-old could really awaken and progress past 3 stages. Even prodigies at the academy, who were a few years older, rarely reached the dark red stage. Arthur overheard them and chose not to mention that he was already at the light red stage, achieved only through limited training due to his beast-will assimilation. It seemed unnecessary to explain everything. Reynolds stepped forward, fists clenched, stating that he was no longer the man he used to be. Arthur lifted his own fists in response, signaling his readiness. He shifted position, vanishing briefly from view. His fist darted toward his father, who blocked it and smiled, acknowledging that his son would have to try harder. Arthur's foot struck his father's arm, followed by a swift elbow. Reynolds caught it and pulled him closer. Arthur retaliated by grabbing his shirt and landing a kick to the leg. He attempted to throw Reynolds over his shoulder, but the older man caught himself midair and leapt backward. Arthur smirked and asked for his thoughts now. Reynolds chuckled and admitted he had been caught off guard. He extended his arms and declared that he would now fight seriously. Flames flickered to life around his fist as he mentioned that this was a trick he learned after reaching the dark orange stage. With a warning, he displayed his fire magic. A brief explanation followed. From the moment of awakening, mages naturally developed affinities toward certain elements. Most families hired instructors to identify these affinities early, allowing proper guidance for their child's growth. Wizards held a distinct advantage in this world since they could manipulate and manifest elements directly. Fighters, while strong, did not possess the same elemental power unless they passed a critical threshold. Arthur observed the flames in his father's hand. He recalled that amplifiers had weaker elemental affinity and only manifested them after reaching a significant core stage. Reynolds, through raw effort and perseverance without formal instruction, had eventually converted his explosive mana into actual fire magic at the deep orange core stage. In the world Arthur came from, elements were not predetermined. Everyone chose their own path, relying on discipline and study. A vision flashed in his mind of a warrior defeating his opponent through sheer will. Talent played a role, yet effort determined the outcome. No one was truly limited by affinity. As Reynolds charged at him, Arthur dodged and countered. He mentally noted that being born with advantages placed expectations on him, yet his progress was earned. Sparks of lightning began to crackle beneath his feet. He had learned a few tricks as well. Arthur controlled the electricity with a confident grin, warning not to be too surprised. Lightning burst from beneath his feet, illuminating the area. Vincent stood in disbelief, quietly acknowledging that Arthur was a deviant. Reynolds tightened his fists, grinning back. The boy made a sudden dash forward, closing the distance between them. As his father prepared to strike, Arthur shifted to the side, avoiding the blow with ease. The man looked pleased, responding with a kick that sent a shock through the ground. Arthur moved again, striking swiftly. An explosion followed as both father and son raised their fists in unison. A brilliant light flashed across the yard. The noise startled everyone nearby, drawing their attention to the scene. Reynolds flew backward, crashing through the trees. He landed just as a leaf touched the ground. Without wasting a moment, he sprang forward again, aiming for his son. Arthur blocked him midair, spreading his arms and releasing a surge of lightning. Reynolds responded with a fiery punch, but the spark grazed his cheek before the attack could land. The man deflected, launching a barrage of strikes. Arthur evaded most, although one strike brushed his cheek. He smiled, impressed by the growing precision of his father's moves. Despite the attacks, Arthur kept his distance, countering with strikes that denied Reynolds the chance to close in. They clashed once more. Arthur's fist hovered just under his father's chin while Reynolds's knee pressed gently at his son's back. Both froze in place, knowing either could have landed a finishing blow. The tension spread to the onlookers. Alice and Tabitha stood frozen, while Ellie and Lilia watched wide-eyed. Vincent's jaw tightened with disbelief. Sylvie yawned, unconcerned. Laughter broke the silence as Reynolds pulled Arthur into a hug. He asked if this was truly the trick his son had learned. The boy thought back to his training with Virion. He knew that while he had a strong affinity with lightning due to his deviant nature, there was still a long path ahead. He held out his hand and formed snowflakes. The ice was fragile and imperfect. Mastery over sound and gravity remained far beyond his reach. His eyes grew wide, recalling the slap he once received from Virion during training. Despite the challenges, a small smile appeared. It felt good to show his parents what he had achieved. Returning to the others, Reynolds asked when he had learned these abilities and what else he could do. Arthur replied that he had only recently begun learning and could barely control them. His strength still lacked depth. He added that beyond this, he had no other abilities yet. Ellie ran forward, asking her father if he was all right. Alice reached to stop her. Vincent, still shaken, combed through his hair and mumbled about needing a drink. Tabitha stood with Lilia, watching the Leywin family. Lilia walked with her parents, stealing one last glance at Arthur and his dragon, a quiet spark of admiration in her eyes. Vincent set his mug down on the table and pointed forward, asking if everyone truly understood the future awaiting Arthur. Reynolds placed a gentle hand on his son's head, recalling that from the moment Arthur woke up, even at the age of 3, he had always known something was different. Tabitha turned to Alice in disbelief, asking again for confirmation. Alice nodded, reminding her how Arthur had once blown apart most of their home. Reynolds chuckled at the memory, claiming those were better days. Vincent, however, suddenly clutched his head, then slammed the table. He proposed enrolling Arthur in Xyrus Academy. Arthur glanced at the man curiously, wondering what kind of place this academy was. Reynolds, now holding his daughter in his arms, mentioned that Arthur was only 8, although the academy remained the most prestigious institution on the continent. Tabitha leaned on one hand and explained that sponsoring Arthur was not only a show of support but also a wise investment, considering his talent. Financial concerns, she added, were unnecessary. Alice raised her hands in protest, refusing to burden them with more favors, especially after everything they had already done. Vincent remained calm. With a slight smile, he mentioned his connection to the academy's director, offering to discuss Arthur's admission directly. Arthur quietly put down his fork and, after a pause, asked to say something. Recognizing how much this decision would affect his future, he wanted to share his thoughts. Night had fallen, and candlelight flickered softly throughout the home. A maid silently cleared the table. Nearby, Reynolds and Alice's daughter had already fallen asleep. The parents remained seated beside Arthur, admiring how he had grown into a beautiful, kind boy. Reynolds glanced at his son and admitted that even after learning Arthur was a deviant, someone with the potential to become one of the strongest magicians, he was still their child. Alice reached for her husband's hand, smiling gently. She turned away, suggesting that perhaps Arthur had grown too old to receive a goodnight kiss from his mother. Arthur exhaled and leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. He lay on his bed and confessed that he missed them. Alice responded, mentioning plans to go shopping the next day. She and her sister needed new clothes, which would also serve as a chance to spend more time together. Reynolds then spoke up, urging Arthur not to hold any resentment toward Vincent for his earlier pushiness. Arthur folded his hands on the table and addressed the adults with calm respect. He expressed that after finally reuniting with his family, he simply wished to be with them a little longer before making any decisions about leaving again. Rising from the table, Arthur excused himself, admitting that the sparring had left him more exhausted than he expected. He left the dining room, and Lilia watched him as he walked down the hallway. He glanced left, then right. Suddenly, Lilia appeared behind him and warned that heading in the wrong direction would lead him to one of their many basements. She pointed ahead, claiming she knew a better way. Soon after, Lilia entered the room with a bright smile, waving as she greeted everyone. An older woman folded her arms and questioned whether this was the boy responsible for burning half the lawn she had spent so much time caring for. Arthur offered an apology. A man beside her waved it off, telling him not to worry. Everyone gathered around the table again. Arthur noticed how lively Lilia had become. Though quiet earlier, this seemed to be her natural state. Picking up her utensils, she asked whether any duck meat remained. The older woman placed a plate in front of her, warning her to slow down since her mother had started asking questions about her recent weight gain. Lilia continued eating and asked Maria to keep it to herself, arguing she was a healthy, growing girl. Her casual tone made everyone smile. She leaned toward Arthur and whispered that the older woman often snuck into the dining room when feeling stressed. After finishing her portion, she demanded that someone save her the pork belly next time as repayment for the earlier comment. From the corner, a man, his eyes still closed, spoke about Sir and Madam's hopes for their daughter to awaken as a mage, although both were mages themselves. Arthur turned toward Lilia. It became clear she also wished to become a mage, but the pressure weighed on her heavily. Despite this, she continued to eat cheerfully. Arthur smiled, watching her. He glanced back at his parents and remarked that the Hellstaya family were genuinely kind people who only wanted the best for those around them. Reynolds and Alice exchanged a quiet smile. Later that night, Alice gently closed her son's door and wished him a peaceful sleep. Morning arrived as Sylvie licked Arthur's face to wake him. He picked her up, acknowledging he was already awake, then glanced ahead while wondering how Tessia was doing. The thought quickly vanished as an unpleasant smell filled his nose. Cringing, Arthur realized Sylvie needed a bath as much as he did. He carried her to the water and soon after, screams echoed through the bathroom. Once the bath was done, Arthur began dressing. He admitted to himself that the experience had not been as terrible as he expected. A knock came at the door. His younger sister, Ellie, stood there, explaining that their mother had asked her to wake him. Arthur knelt and asked her to lead him to Alice. The boys ran through the mansion and soon arrived at the market district. The city buzzed with activity. Arthur walked ahead, taking in the view, then turned to ask if this really was the city of Xyrus. He looked through the window of a nearby store where people were gathered inside. Curiously, he asked what was being sold. Inside, a woman explained that the small glowing orbs on display were beast cores, magical objects extracted from mana beasts. These cores could increase one's strength, although the effects varied. With enough gold, one could even gamble for a rare core that contained the will of a beast. Arthur listened silently, reflecting that he was content with Sylvie as his companion. The woman added that their auction house often received beast cores and occasionally young mana beasts. Arthur nodded politely in thanks. Lilia appeared behind him and nudged his back, insisting there was a place she wanted to show him. They walked together to a barber shop. The barber clicked his scissors and eyed Arthur. The boy glanced at his mother, already filled with dread, and asked if this really had to happen. Alice insisted his hair was in terrible condition. The barber took hold of Arthur's head, declaring confidently that he would make him shine. With a playful smirk, he added that the boy was a flawless gem. Arthur responded with a silent cry of despair. When the haircut was done, the girls around him admired the result. Ellie raised her fist proudly, declaring that he was now presentable enough to be her brother. Arthur stood there, visibly embarrassed. After they left the shop, Alice remarked that he finally looked like a civilized young man. They continued across a stone bridge. Arthur's attention shifted to a group nearby. Lilia explained that those were students from Xyrus Academy. She leaned on the railing, saying their uniforms represented prestige and status. Arthur commented that they seemed arrogant. Lilia replied that within this city, those students were treated almost like royalty. Alice joined the conversation and asked what they were discussing. Lilia responded that they had been talking about the academy. Arthur, momentarily excited, ran ahead. The women behind him shared a smile. It was rare to see him act his age, especially after the events of the previous day. Their smiles faded slightly as they remembered it. The group entered a shop shortly after, where a bell chimed above the door. Arthur's eyes sparkled. Before him stood rows of weaponry. A man near the counter noticed him and scowled, telling him that the store was not meant for children. Arthur responded politely, saying that these did not resemble the toy swords he had at home. When the man attempted to place a hand on Arthur's shoulder, the boy brushed it away and headed for the door, apologizing for causing any trouble. The man stopped him with a sneer, questioning what kind of household raised such a rude child. Before Arthur could respond, a woman entered the store. It was Tabitha. She ordered the man to remove his hands from her son. The man scoffed, demanding if she understood who she was talking to. He introduced himself as Xyrus, trying to assert control. However, his expression quickly shifted to panic as Tabitha reminded him that she could easily prevent his family from participating in their auction. Xyrus fell to his knees and apologized repeatedly. Arthur gave a small smile and thanked Tabitha for stepping in. She smiled back, admitting that she had been worried about how Arthur might react. The man watched them in silence, his face darkening. Sylvie ran beside Arthur, tail wagging. Evening settled in. The group returned to the Helstea mansion. Vincent raised his hand in greeting and smiled, saying he had someone he wanted Arthur to meet. The boy walked forward with a curious expression. An elderly woman stood before him and introduced herself as Cynthia Goodsky, founder and director of Xyrus Academy. Xyrus Academy stood as the pinnacle of magical institutions across the continent. It served as a sanctuary for noble-born individuals gifted in mana manipulation. Renowned scholars, high-ranking guild members, royal guards, and key figures in the military all had ties to the academy. Its reputation towered above the countless lesser schools scattered across the land. At the helm of this revered institution was a widely respected headmaster. Arthur faced the old woman, and their eyes briefly met. Everyone in the room fell silent as Cynthia stepped forward and extended her hand. Arthur hesitated, unsure whether to shake it or kiss it, before finally reaching out to greet her. Alice immediately pressed her son down in apology, explaining his unfamiliarity with formal customs since he had only recently returned home. Arthur frowned, more concerned with his empty stomach than the situation. Cynthia raised her hand gently and insisted that the interruption had been her fault for arriving so late. She gestured toward Vincent and acknowledged that she had accepted his invitation due to his remarkable contributions to the academy. He responded modestly, stating that he simply wished to support the institution he hoped his daughter Lilia would attend one day. Lilia frowned quietly and turned her gaze elsewhere. Cynthia stepped closer and explained that it was rare for her to personally visit a potential student's home. However, Vincent's persistent praise of a young prodigy in his household had piqued her interest. She turned to Tabitha and asked if Arthur could be brought outside for a brief demonstration. When Arthur asked whether he could eat first, his mother pinched him without a word. Reynolds and Alice opened the door and led the way into the courtyard, which featured a neatly paved area suitable for magical displays. Arthur sighed, muttering to Sylvie that their dinner would have to wait. The small creature trudged down the stairs beside him. Without turning, Cynthia asked if the beast accompanying him was his father's contracted companion. Arthur responded that the bond between him and Sylvie had formed shortly after she hatched a few months ago. Cynthia observed Sylvie with interest, remarking that while nobles often purchased mana beasts to form contracts, she had never encountered one quite like this. Arthur replied that Sylvie's mother had been a scaly, winged wolf, mortally wounded while protecting her egg. He had found the nest by chance and considered himself fortunate. Cynthia remained thoughtful. Vincent pointed toward the courtyard and indicated that the area was ready. They moved into the open space. She addressed Arthur directly, expressing her interest in determining whether Vincent's claims had been exaggerated. Arthur confirmed that he was an augmenter but refrained from revealing more, saying that he preferred to let his actions speak. Cynthia examined his demeanor closely. His composure confused her. She wondered whether it stemmed from confidence or arrogance. Arthur, distracted by the scent of fried fish from the kitchen, appeared far more focused on the idea of food than on the evaluation ahead. Vincent, full of anticipation, assured her that Arthur would demonstrate fire and lightning magic. He added that, fortunately, the yard could not be destroyed like during previous training sessions. Cynthia asked if Arthur needed a weapon, but he replied that since she did not plan to use the wand on her belt, he would remain unarmed. She acknowledged his remark with a slight smile and suggested they begin. Arthur reflected on the training he had received under Virion. Techniques from his former world, particularly fire, water, and flexible counter-based key arts, had begun to manifest as actual elements in this one. More recently, martial styles such as earth and wind-based techniques had evolved and taken on physical form. He took a deep breath and focused. The ground beneath his foot cracked as mana surged through his body. His frame began to emit a faint glow, and the cracks deepened. Arthur recalled the importance of directing internal and external mana into precise elemental forms. This concept, taught by Virion, had become a foundation for his development as an augmenter. He raised one leg, shifted his weight, and drove his foot down. The tile underfoot shattered instantly. Arthur stepped forward with renewed confidence. The gathered spectators stood in awe. Ellie and Sylvie watched him closely, both showing signs of admiration. Arthur considered the differences between mages and augmenters. While the former channeled magic through spells and artifacts, the latter utilized physical strength enhanced by mana. These simple movements marked the first steps in an elemental manifestation for an augmenter. He advanced another step, intrigued by how the director of the most prestigious magical academy would respond to what came next. His leg rose once more. Then, with precision and force, he kicked forward into a stone tile. The chunk of stone launched ahead like a projectile, streaking across the yard in a blur of raw power. The stone shot through the air, aimed directly at the elderly woman. Cynthia raised an eyebrow, seemingly caught off guard. A protective field shimmered around her, absorbing the impact without a scratch. She extended her hand, and a flurry of stones answered her command. Arthur scowled as he dodged, feeling the sharp press of wind against his skin. The boy flew backward, regaining balance mid-air before launching himself toward her once more. Cynthia remained composed, her hand rising as Arthur approached. Before he could land an attack, a surge of mana pulsed outward. Arthur's eyes widened. The wave of force sent him soaring across the courtyard. He clenched his teeth and shifted course, weaving through the air. With a gust of wind beneath his feet, he called upon a slab of earth and steadied himself atop it. Despite his extensive training with Virion, coordinating both earth and wind spells remained a challenge. He needed focus. Drawing a deep breath, he centered his mana, then pushed forward once again. The old woman's calm expression did not falter. With a casual wave, she summoned a whirlpool of stones. The courtyard trembled under the pressure. Onlookers shielded their faces as strong gales tore through the space. Arthur dropped low and landed on all fours, narrowly avoiding the blast. A silhouette moved within the whirlwind, faint but unmistakable. He barely caught her voice through the chaos. She was already preparing another spell. He lifted his gaze, stunned by the rapid sequence of magic. Dozens of mini whirlwinds swirled around Cynthia's hands, each one pulsing with precise control. Arthur responded quickly, manipulating the surrounding air to push against the approaching spells. It was a desperate defense. His clothes tore from the pressure. As the gust subsided, he looked up to see her smiling. Kneeling now, Arthur steadied his breath. Cynthia watched him closely. She noted that his skill was remarkable, though his overconfidence had left openings. With a snap of her fingers, the remaining tornadoes vanished. Her tone grew more serious. What he had demonstrated was extraordinary. She announced one final test, a challenge of endurance. A piercing sound filled the air. Arthur covered his ears, wincing. It was a sound-based spell. The resonance dug deep into his skull. He realized she was a deviant. Even through the noise, Cynthia's amusement was visible. She turned away, approaching Reynolds. She stated calmly that Arthur had passed. His aptitude, especially his affinity for wind magic, impressed her. She expressed interest in taking him as her personal student. Reynolds turned to his son, surprised. He had not realized Arthur could use earth and wind spells so effectively. Cynthia furrowed her brows at the remark. Vincent, pale with disbelief, interjected. Just the day before, Arthur had demonstrated both fire and lightning spells. That was why he had brought her here instead of indoors. Their lawn had been scorched. The headmistress narrowed her eyes. She asked directly if the boy could control 3 basic elements and 1 advanced type. Arthur clarified that he could use 4. He raised his hand and stated that he had an affinity with all 4 primary elements. Reynolds looked astonished. Cynthia reeled from the answer. Ellie turned to Alice, asking whether her little brother was truly that powerful. Cynthia laughed, her voice carrying pride. She said that Arthur would likely become the strongest of them all. Arthur reflected on the moment. Once the excitement had calmed, he apologized to his family. He had not intended to keep such a secret from them. Alice only laughed, asking him to avoid hiding anything else in the future. Her words stirred something inside him. He wished he could make that promise. Joy returned to the household as the reality of Arthur's success settled in. Cynthia placed a hand on his shoulder. A shimmering dome enclosed them, isolating them from the others. Their voices became inaudible beyond its boundary. With her eyes closed, Cynthia explained that no one outside could hear them now. She asked for his thoughts. Arthur, calm yet aware, replied with a quiet smile. It seemed to him that she could already see through everything. Looking at his hand, he explained why he had revealed his strength. She had power and influence, two things he needed. In return, he asked for her protection over his family until he was strong enough to defend them himself. He stated clearly that he would join her academy. Beyond that, he would consider her a benefactor. Cynthia tilted her head, amused by his boldness. She laughed, noting that not even the king or queen of Sapin had dared to offer her such an unbalanced agreement. Arthur replied without hesitation. Unlike them, he understood the potential she saw in him. He believed she recognized it too. Although he accepted her support, he clarified that his side of the deal would have to wait until he officially enrolled. Her expression shifted slightly. She asked what he meant. Arthur closed his eyes and spoke with conviction. He had made a promise to someone important. To honor that promise, he had to live his life to the fullest. Joining the academy at a normal age would be the first step. Cynthia raised a hand to her mouth, startled. 3 years would pass before he enrolled. She asked what he planned to do during that time. Arthur looked back at his parents. He had not shared his decision with them yet. With steady resolve, he revealed the path he had chosen. He was going to become an adventurer. A scream echoed from behind the door. Alice's voice broke through the silence, filled with disbelief. Near the entrance stood 3 people. Vincent noted that something had already begun. Ellie was tugging on her mother's skirt while Alice demanded to know why Arthur had come back after everyone believed he was dead, only to now declare his intention to leave again. She refused to accept it. Not unless it was over her dead body. Tears streamed down the girl's face as she begged her mother not to be angry. Sylvie stayed hidden under her feet. Reynolds placed a hand on Alice's shoulder. Although he did not agree with Arthur's decision to become an adventurer, he was willing to listen. Alice, however, glared at him. She questioned how he could say such a thing after everything they had endured. Emotion overwhelmed her as she burst into tears. She asked if he truly understood what this meant. Arthur hugged her gently. The light filtered down on Arthur's face as he reached for his mother's hand. He had no intention of leaving immediately. In truth, he looked forward to spending a few peaceful months at home. The family stood united. Though his return was recent, Arthur felt the weight of all he had missed during the past 3 years in the Elven Kingdom. Much has changed in the rest of the world. He smiled faintly. He wanted to relive the kind of experiences his father once had as an adventurer. Reynolds observed his son with pride. He acknowledged the boy's determination. Even in his youth, Reynolds had dreamed of the same path. Though he closed his eyes with concern, he admitted that Alice's worries were not misplaced. Arthur reached down to pet Sylvie. Reynolds reminded him that no matter how strong or prepared he believed himself to be, an adventurer's life remained unpredictable and dangerous. Arthur considered a solution. He placed a hand in his pocket and suggested having a guard or warden accompany him. Alice wiped away a tear. Reynolds, stroking his chin, thought it was not a bad idea. The thought lingered, who would be suitable? Alice grabbed her husband and shook him. She refused to believe he was entertaining the notion. She would not let her son vanish for 3 years. They eventually sat together on the couch. Alice clarified that she was not agreeing to 3 years of separation. Arthur explained he intended to return often, possibly every few months, depending on his missions. Alice folded her arms, skeptical. She needed a real answer. Why this path? Why not attend school before venturing out into the world? Arthur scratched his head, then shared that he would be much younger than the others if he enrolled now. It might make it difficult to connect or form lasting friendships. She pictured him sitting among older students. Her husband gently stroked her head in reassurance. Alice reluctantly admitted that perhaps he did not have to enroll immediately. Maybe he could assist his father in the meantime. Reynolds cut her off, expressing confidence in their son's strength and judgment. Arthur smiled, grateful for the support. He clenched his fist, determined not only to train, but to test his abilities in real-world situations. Alice tapped her husband's cheek affectionately. Though sweet, the gesture carried a hint of frustration. Sylvie chirped softly, encouraging him to embrace life. The sky above glittered with stars. Nearby, a maid swept the yard. From the window, a voice reminded Reynolds to slow down and chew his food. At the dining table, several people sat together. he responded with a grin. Finally, he could enjoy a meal without work weighing him down. One of the girls asked if he planned to attend the auction and introduce new recruits. The others blushed, realizing it was likely an excuse to host a welcome party. Another girl, covering her face, commented on the growing food expenses. Embarrassment filled the room. Arthur, holding a spoonful of food, asked what the day's plans were. Tabitha, sipping from her mug, replied that she and Alice were running errands to prepare for an upcoming event at the Hellstay auction house. They planned to take Ellie and Lilia along. If Arthur wanted, he could join them. He coughed and politely declined, choosing to remain home. Vincent raised a question about Arthur's future. The boy sat quietly on Alice's lap. She replied that they had reached an agreement under specific conditions. Reynolds held up 3 fingers. First, Arthur would wait until his birthday in 3 months. Second, he must be accompanied by protection during every mission. Third, he had to visit home at least once every 2 months. Arthur shared food with Sylvie. Vincent scratched his cheek, recognizing the logic behind the conditions, though unsure of who could meet the requirement. Who could serve as such a capable escort? Everyone imagined the challenge. One of the girls groaned, pressing her fork against her forehead, saying she saw herself in that poor soul. Vincent responded sharply, calling it inappropriate. Suddenly, Reynolds rose from the table. He recalled a letter from the Adventurers Guild. The Twin Horns would return from a dungeon expedition in 2 months. One of them could accompany Arthur. Alice turned to her husband. She admitted the idea was actually sound. Reynolds asked if she was truly surprised he could offer a good idea. Arthur, listening nearby, felt a warm sense of anticipation. He remembered them all. Most importantly, he looked forward to seeing them again soon. Vincent sat quietly at his desk, jotting a simple note in his notebook. The message read like a plea for help, polite and straightforward. A knock interrupted his thoughts. When he opened the door, Arthur stood in the hallway. Vincent mentioned that he had just missed his father, who was currently at the auction house. Arthur smiled and explained that he had come to discuss something important. After a brief hesitation, Vincent allowed him inside. Outside, in the bustling market, a crowd had gathered. A blue cloak fluttered in the wind. Alice examined the scene while commenting on whether such extravagant displays were suitable for an anniversary celebration. Tabitha assured her that noble ladies adored the jewelry she had crafted. Alice studied the necklace, puzzled by how others could find such items appealing. With a wink, Tabitha shared that she had secretly taken a few pieces from home to decorate the private rooms in their auction house. Alice reacted sharply, calling the pieces simple and cheaply made. Embarrassed, she blushed, admitting how shameful it felt. Meanwhile, Lilia leaned toward Ellie, teasing her about being upset that her brother had not come shopping with them. Lilia turned her head, expressing that while they had come together, she now understood she was no longer a priority. Arthur's presence had shifted Ellie's attention. Ellie, flustered, shouted back, claiming her affection for her brother didn't mean others didn't matter. Lilia then dramatically declared that Arthur loved her most and that Ellie was ready to throw her away now that he had returned. A hand came down sharply on her head. Tabitha glared at her daughter, demanding to know why she was upsetting the child. Tearfully, Lilia explained she was only teasing because all Ellie thought about lately was Arthur. Tabitha raised an eyebrow, asking if perhaps her daughter had discovered her first love. Lilia quickly denied it, tugging at her mother's dress, calling Arthur a weirdo. Her lips trembled as she admitted that she had never believed someone their age could already be a mage. The confession surprised Tabitha. Fists clenched, Lilia said she didn't understand why Arthur remained so composed while waiting for his awakening, considering he was already stronger than most adults. Tears welled in her eyes. She felt it was unfair. She wanted to awaken too, to grow stronger, to be someone who made others proud. The women exchanged glances. Alice gently placed a hand on Lilia's shoulder, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. Alice explained that comparing herself to Arthur was unwise. Arthur had always been different. When asked how he had become so powerful, and if it had been through training from her and Reynolds, Alice hesitated. She clarified that aside from some basic sword lessons from his father, they had not contributed much to his progress. This revelation surprised Tabitha. Blushing slightly, Tabitha was wondering if they were overlooking something important. She quickly apologized, saying she did not intend to interfere. Alice thanked her for her concern, admitting that both she and Reynolds were aware Arthur was hiding something. She opened her hands in a helpless gesture. Lilia pressed further, questioning why they had not simply asked Arthur how he had become so strong or how he had developed such sword mastery. She believed both parents were curious. Alice gave a tender look and responded that they trusted there was a reason for Arthur's secrecy. Rather than push him, they had chosen to give him space until he was ready to share. Their conversation continued as they walked down the street, unaware that they were being watched from around the corner. A figure cloaked in darkness moved through the empty street. He stopped and passed a message to another in similar attire. The news was simple: the Mana beast was not with them today, and a mage from Xyrus Academy had been assigned as a guard. He had kept his distance, yet he confirmed that the boy, likely the beast's master, would attend the auction house's anniversary celebration. The stranger snapped his fingers, declaring that the best opportunity would arise from that event and he had to inform Master Sebastian of this new development. Another cloaked figure listened silently from above. Inside his office, Vincent watched Arthur sip his tea. He remained quiet, contemplating the situation. For a moment, he imagined a young monarch on a throne, an image that matched the sense of presence Arthur exuded. It felt more daunting than an audience with the King of Sapin. Arthur placed his mug down, expressing his thanks for the tea. Vincent adjusted his glasses and observed the boy's composed demeanor, so unlike how he acted around family. Perhaps this was his true self. Arthur calmly stated the reason for his visit. He had a request. Vincent listened carefully as Arthur explained he needed a few specific items: a protective cloak with a hood, a sword suitable for his size, and a voice-changing mask. The request made the man blink. The cloak would be easy, though the mask posed a challenge. Only a sound affinity deviant craftsman could create such an item. Despite being overwhelmed with work from the anniversary event, he found himself considering the favor. Arthur smiled and offered his gratitude. The gesture left Vincent momentarily stunned. Arthur then explained that, while he lacked money, he had thought of a way to repay the favor. Vincent dismissed the need for compensation, saying Arthur's father had supported him greatly, helping reduce crime and violence in the auction house to its lowest level. Even so, Arthur revealed one of his goals was to assist his sister with her awakening. He had recently discovered a method that could help her. If successful, the same method could benefit Lilia. The offer caught Vincent's interest. Arthur rose from his chair and added that while he knew Vincent and his wife were not mages, he believed he could guide their daughter through her awakening and into Xyrus Academy. A small ball rolled across the wooden floor as Arthur gripped the edge of the bed. Faint lightning currents shimmered beneath his tired eyes. After weeks of effort, he could only maintain it for a few seconds. He exhaled sharply, and the image of Virian and Cynthia briefly appeared behind him. According to him, his efforts still weren't enough. Morning light crept over the walls of the house. The ball remained untouched while Arthur lay quietly on the floor. Outside, the ladies helped their children down from carriages. Arthur, lost in his thoughts, reminded himself of some memories of his past life. In that memory, lightning split the sky as rain poured down. A boy sprinted through the streets, clutching a soaked bag. He stumbled. Books spilled out, splashing water in all directions. Up ahead, a crowd had gathered. Medics knelt beside a lifeless body. Police barred the area. Inside a clear roll held in an officer's hand was a weapon. The boy screamed. He tried to rush forward, only to be held back. Then, he couldn't protect the ones he loved. With that as fuel, he had carved a need within him, an unshakable desire to grow stronger, not out of vengeance, but to protect those he cherished. Arthur's face now glistened with sweat. Sylvie spoke to him, her presence grounding. He reached down to gently stroke her head. It turned out the ladies were back from their shopping trip. He threw on a shirt and stepped out of his room. On the stairs, Alice met him halfway. Her voice held a hint of worry. She questioned how he planned to help Lilia awaken. Even as a harmless comment, the topic felt too fragile. Arthur smiled and greeted everyone gathered below. Lilia's mother frowned, voicing concern. He assured her he would never joke about something so serious. A proposal had been made to her husband, and it had been accepted. Vincent lifted his daughter and led them into the living room. The others followed, exchanging uncertain glances. Everyone settled into the common area, curiosity mingling with doubt. Arthur sat between the two girls. He asked them to focus on their breathing, guiding them into a specific rhythm. Inhale through the nose slowly, filling their lungs. Then, inhale again with their mouths. Finally, release short bursts of breath, 15 times. He repeated the pattern, encouraging them to relax and close their eyes. He explained that once the rhythm was right, they might begin to see lights floating in the darkness. Lilia's parents watched with concern. Ellie gasped softly. She claimed to see the lights, though they faded quickly. Arthur chuckled. It happened because she had stopped breathing. Lilia grew tense, asking if something was wrong with her. Arthur reassured her. Neither of her parents were mages, so the delay was expected. Still, the adults exchanged uneasy glances. Angela voiced her doubts. Teaching someone to awaken artificially was unheard of. It had always been a natural event, not something guided. Arthur insisted that he was going to help the girls do what he did to awaken when he was 3, and the reason he thought he could do this was his affinity with the 4 elements. Arthur steadied his hands on the girls' backs and walked them through the breathing again. His mana flowed gently toward them. Lights shimmered around their small figures. Lilia smiled, delighted. Ellie followed, her joy contagious. Arthur asked them to pull the lights together. Those lights, he said, were friends, gentle fragments of mana. Arthur sighed, his body drained. He had given all he could. The girls fell back with him, breathless and flushed. Their parents rose quickly. Vincent asked if it had worked. Arthur answered calmly. With consistent training, Lilia would awaken in time. It would take years, but the path had been opened. Overcome with emotion, Angela embraced Arthur tightly. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she apologized for her earlier doubt. Thanks to him, her daughter now had a chance they had never thought possible. Tears welled in Lilia's eyes too. She spotted her father across the room, crying quietly, pride and joy filling his face. White feathers floated gently in the air, catching the light as they drifted past. From that moment forward, Arthur's days followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began with personal training. Then he dedicated time to help Ellie and Lilia inch closer to their awakening. Every day at dawn, they met in the living room. Arthur guided their breathing, corrected their posture, and channeled mana with them. The pace gradually increased. Soon, the room itself hummed with magic. Air would still, sparks would flash faintly in the corners. They were getting closer. Their families often gathered nearby, observing with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. Around the dining table, laughter and conversation flowed. These peaceful moments felt fleeting. Arthur treasured them. Even as his heart pushed him toward strength, he took care to stay grounded in the present. Time slipped by, yet he remained focused. His impatience to become stronger never outweighed his responsibility to those around him. He knew the future would bring challenges. He knew the time with them like this would not last. So, he made each moment count, guiding, protecting, and quietly preparing. 2 months had passed. In the hallway of the Hellstaya mansion, Alice and Reynolds waited nervously near the tall bookshelf. She glanced at him, asking if he was excited to see the twin horns again. It had been a long time since their last meeting. Reynolds looked down at Arthur, who stood by the front door, and remarked that their son seemed just as eager. At that moment, Sylvie leapt gracefully and landed on Arthur's shoulder. He bent slightly under her weight, muttering that she might be too big for that now. A knock sounded. Arthur rushed to the door and opened it quickly. Angela stepped in and immediately embraced him. Her arms tightened, and tears filled her eyes. It had been too difficult for her to process how much he had grown. Arthur, pressed against her chest, mumbled that he couldn't breathe. Durden placed a hand on her shoulder, prompting her to let go. She wiped her face and explained she had gotten emotional. Arthur turned toward Durden, surprised at how big he had become. A tear slid down his cheek at the memory of their earlier days. Durden ruffled the boy's hair and joked that Arthur had changed just as much. From the doorway, Adam reminded them that the plan was to appear cheerful for Arthur's sake. Behind him, a large golden spear stood out. He pointed toward Sylvie, asking if anyone would comment on the black mana beast lounging nearby. Helen seized him from behind, bow in hand, and brushed off his dramatic entrance. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she observed Arthur, remarking on how grown and handsome he had become. Adam broke free and asked whether he was heartless for not crying. He added that perhaps he had simply matured enough to hold back his tears. Jasmine interrupted everyone by sprinting forward and hugging Arthur tightly. Without speaking, she began to sob, apologizing repeatedly through her tears. The emotional atmosphere overwhelmed the entire group. One by one, tears welled up in every eye. Even Alice and Reynolds couldn't contain their emotions. Reynolds sighed, realizing they had missed this long-awaited moment. Elsewhere, Vincent adjusted his handkerchief and asked whether conjurers were still unnecessary for the occasion. Reynolds replied from the doorway, assuring him that Angela and another windcaster were alternating detection barriers around the auction house, with Durden stationed at the entrance. He explained that over-preparing would give the impression of expecting war. Standing in front of the mirror, Vincent expressed gratitude for the team's support. Reynolds replied that their presence allowed him to place additional guards around the nearby block. With a wink, he stated they could handle any outside threat while keeping the guests safe and the venue intact. He laughed aloud at his own joke. Vincent, slightly embarrassed, admitted he knew it was humor, but given recent experiences, he might hold him to that promise. He hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Then, he lifted his fists playfully, mentioning that Arthur had recently requested a sword before registering as an adventurer. He hadn't expected the boy to ask, given that Reynolds fought with gauntlets and had never trained him with a blade. Stroking his stubble, Reynolds replied that all he had done was buy the boy a wooden sword. Arthur had apparently been learning on his own since he was 4. Vincent was surprised by this and seemed skeptical. Reynolds continued, explaining that Arthur had always claimed to be self-taught, but during their spars, there were brief moments when he displayed a strange pressure. He gestured toward the armored warrior nearby and added that the boy often showed an unnerving confidence, as though he had been fighting for decades. Vincent laughed softly, reminding him that Arthur hadn't even lived 10 years. Perhaps he was attributing too much to his son. Reynolds waved it off but admitted that in their matches, Arthur would sometimes stumble or hesitate, like someone not fully accustomed to their body. Vincent smiled knowingly and offered his theory with a shrug: early puberty. Reynolds then suggested they head downstairs, as everyone else was already waiting. As they descended the staircase, Tabitha met them partway. She noted how strange it was that the 2 grown men were the last to get ready. When Vincent saw the group gathered at the entrance, he froze. Everyone was dressed in elegant black and white attire, presenting a unified and formal image. Scratching his head, he commented that it was unfortunate they had forced the Leywin family to follow the strict dress code. Since they were the event hosts, he didn't want them to feel obligated. Alice, cradling the youngest child, responded calmly that bright colors had never suited her anyway. Arthur touched his face with one hand, slightly uncomfortable. No matter how he dressed, he still looked like a cute child. He hoped he would grow up soon enough. Vincent clapped his hands to gather attention. The butler opened the door, motioning toward the carriages outside. Vincent encouraged everyone to board if they were ready. Placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder with a sense of pride, Vincent addressed him, mentioning that his daughter had made impressive progress. Arthur smiled in response. If she continued, she would awaken her mana core in time to enroll at Xyrus Academy. He leaned in slightly and thanked Arthur, spreading his hand in a gesture of agreement. Arthur stated that he was simply fulfilling his side of the arrangement and looked forward to seeing what surprises awaited at the auction house. The group stepped out into the yard, now prepared for what the day would bring. Carriages rolled steadily through the vibrant streets, which were adorned with colorful flags swaying in the breeze. Excited chatter filled the air as boys smiled and joked among themselves. Arthur sat comfortably with the group, a cheerful expression on his face. Adam glanced at him with disbelief, still unable to wrap his head around the events that followed Arthur's fall from the cliff. Helen observed him with a slight smirk, pointing out that, despite everything, Arthur had found his own mana beast, an achievement even seasoned adventurers and nobles rarely accomplished. Arthur's gaze softened as he looked down at Sylvie, who rested on his lap. His affection for her was clear. The carriage eventually came to a halt, its creaking wheels drawing attention. Angela peered through the window, confirming their arrival. Everyone's eyes shifted to the boys waiting outside, ready to greet them. Arthur stepped out, scanning his surroundings with quiet amazement. The magnificent structure before him, grand and elegant, left his mouth slightly agape. It had to be the Hellstay auction house. Behind the mansion stood rows of tall, green trees, while an array of weapons was displayed proudly along its perimeter. Arthur reminded himself that this was no ordinary event. It marked the 10th anniversary of the Hellstay auction house, attracting nobles and adventurers alike. The celebration was more than ceremonial. Priceless artifacts, locked away until now, were expected to be unveiled and sold. Inside the hall, a flurry of activity filled the space. Assistants moved quickly, transporting items behind thick glass walls. The glow of multicolored beast cores sparkled under the chandeliers. Arthur's attention drifted to a large, unidentifiable statue, and he found himself once again admiring the architecture. The grandeur of the building's interior matched its elegant facade. Vincent stood nearby, eyes gleaming with anticipation. With a clenched fist raised, he reminded the group to stay focused and ensure no mistakes were made. Arthur, facing Reynolds' back, watched as his father issued orders to the team. He instructed them to check the side corridors every half hour before returning to their original positions. His presence carried authority. Helen soon approached Arthur, prompting a conversation. Arthur expressed how satisfying it was to see his father in such command, very different from how he acted at home. Helen agreed, remarking that leadership suited him. Though she had taken Reynolds' spot during his absence, she admitted she still had much to learn. With a light pat on Arthur's back, she excused herself to rejoin the operation. Not long after, Alice called out to her son, motioning him to follow. Standing at the entrance with the others, she informed Arthur that Reynolds and Vincent would join them shortly. The group entered through tall double doors into an expansive hall, where a man stood on stage, likely the auctioneer. Sofas lined the balconies while glass partitions provided an elevated view of the main floor. Arthur took it all in, quietly impressed. Despite living among royalty in Eleanor, he acknowledged the sophistication of this place. Tabitha approached, teasingly asking what he thought of their so-called auction house. Arthur gave a confused smile, suggesting she was downplaying the word house. Tabitha chuckled, pleased with his reaction. Lilia nudged Arthur, hinting at the private viewing rooms upstairs. Curiosity sparked in the kids as they made their way up the staircase. Alice gently reminded Ellie to be careful on the steps. Once at the top, an assistant welcomed them and opened the doors to their reserved room. Inside, ornate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow. Arthur stood still, soaking in the magnificence of the chamber. Tabitha and Lilia beamed, arms outstretched as they welcomed everyone in. Tabitha mentioned that more special guests were expected later, but for now, everyone could relax. Alice and Tabitha approached the bar, while Lilia waved at Ellie, inviting her over. The girls pressed her hands against the glass and looked ahead, startled by the growing crowd. People dressed in formal attire began filling the hall. The women observed their children with fondness. Tabitha inquired what the kids were up to, and Lilia answered that Ellie had been trying to count the guests. Tabitha found it amusing. Lilia leaned toward Ellie and suggested they switch to a hand-clapping game instead. Laughter filled the room as the children entertained themselves, their mothers joining in the joy. Arthur watched them, content with the light-hearted atmosphere. An assistant approached, apologizing for interrupting. He informed them that the VIP guests had arrived. The kids straightened, hands folded, awaiting their entrance. Two knights stepped inside, followed by a hooded figure. Vincent smiled, extending his hand and requesting permission to introduce the newcomers. As they entered, their expressions remained composed. Vincent introduced them as His Majesty Blaine Glader, Her Majesty Priscilla Glader, Prince Curtis Glader, and Princess Kathleen Glader. In unison, the boys knelt on one knee. Arthur immediately recognized the familiar tone of royalty, similar to what he felt in Eleanor. Blaine glanced at Vincent, his tone reserved. He seemed surprised to be sharing the space. Vincent apologized, explaining that he recalled their interest in meeting his family and thought this occasion appropriate. Tabitha and Lilia also knelt respectfully. Vincent introduced Alice, explaining that she was the wife of a close friend, along with their children Arthur and Eleanor Leywin. The royal couple looked upon the children with kind smiles. Blaine assured them that Vincent's friends were welcome, inviting everyone to rise. He reminded them that this was a celebration of the Helstea auction house's legacy, encouraging them to enjoy the day. Priscilla added that formalities were unnecessary, expressing her pleasure at having some company beyond the royal guards. Sylvie lay curled on the couch, resting against the armrest. Priscilla's gaze softened as she admired the creature, calling her both cute and intelligent. Arthur explained that Sylvie had hatched a few months prior and that she was his bond. As if understanding, Sylvie climbed onto Arthur's shoulder, purring. Arthur mentioned they could communicate mentally, so it felt like mutual agreement rather than obedience. The man behind the royals, now revealed to be Sebastian, frowned and pulled down his hood. He questioned the meaning of Arthur's statement. Arthur clarified that Sylvie had initiated the bond. Sebastian asked to examine their link more closely. However, Blaine stepped in, blocking him. With a stern look, he reminded Sebastian that this was not the time nor place to study pets and asked whether he had forgotten he was on duty. Humbled, Sebastian knelt and asked for forgiveness. Everyone in the room had turned their attention to the interaction. Tabitha calmly pointed toward the main seating area, reminding the royals that the event was about to begin. Blaine nodded in appreciation, leading the group to their seats. Arthur cast a wary glance at Sebastian, who returned the look with quiet displeasure before pulling his hood back over his head.